There are worse ways to die than being thrown into the ground like garbage by the men who once swore they would follow you into any battle. I know because I tried all of them first. My name was Kale Duran, and for 31 years I carried the Duran bloodline like armor nobody could see and nobody respected. The Duran family were stone shapers, cultivators who drew power directly from the earth itself, bending granite, commanding bedrock, pulling mountains by the roots if necessary. In the old days, a century before I was born, the Duran name made armies reroute. Warlords sent tribute. Cities negotiated rather than marched because nobody fought the earth and won. By the time I arrived into this world, screaming and inconvenient, the name meant something considerably smaller. One crumbling estate, 3 loyal servants, a technique half forgotten. My father died when I was 6, leaving me the estate, the servants, and a training manual written in a dialect so old that half the symbols required a scholar just to read aloud. My mother remarried within the year, choosing a man from the Varek clan, which, if you know anything about how betrayal typically works in cultivation families, tells you everything already. The Varek clan were earth cultivators too, distantly related by bloodline to my own family through a branch marriage. 3 generations back, nobody bothered remembering at formal dinners. That distant connection was exactly what they used to justify everything they would eventually take from me, framing robbery as inheritance correction and murder as rightful reclamation. Oren Varek was my stepfather's name, and he smiled at me the first time we met with the particular warmth of a man who has already decided what he plans to do with your things. "You look just like your father," he said, clapping my shoulder with a hand that felt like a stone press. "Same jaw, same eyes. Let's hope not the same stubbornness, for your sake." I was 7 years old. I smiled back because my mother was watching, and even at 7 I understood that certain smiles are armor, not joy, and I was already learning to wear it. The Varek household moved into the Duran estate 6 months later, bringing with them 17 relatives, 24 servants, and a complete reorganization of everything my father had built. My training schedule was the first thing they adjusted, replacing the old Duran earth-shaping techniques with Varek-style cultivation that happened to require the student to share progress reports. Progress reports that Oren Varek read carefully every week, noting which techniques I'd mastered, which abilities had developed naturally, which parts of my bloodline talent were emerging. I didn't understand what he was doing at the time. I was 10 years old, then 12, then 14, working harder than any other student in the household simply to prove I belonged there. The Varek cousins made sure I understood my position clearly, in case the daily schedule of fetching water, cleaning training grounds, and eating last at every meal left any ambiguity. "You're a guest here," Cousin Tarn told me once, after pushing my dinner off the table and watching it shatter on the stone floor. "Guests don't complain. Guests say thank you." I said thank you. I cleaned the floor. I went back to my room and practiced the old Duran techniques in secret from the manual my father left me, hidden beneath a loose hearthstone. At 16, something happened that even the Varek clan hadn't anticipated, despite all their careful monitoring of my progress reports and their methodical patience across those years. The Duran bloodline awakened, not gradually, not in stages the way most cultivation talents developed, building slowly through diligent practice and patient accumulation of spiritual energy. It awakened all at once in the middle of the night while I was practicing alone in my room, and the floor cracked beneath me in a perfect circle 6 meters in every direction. I remember looking down at my own hands and seeing them glowing faintly with a deep, amber light, like sunlight trapped inside granite, like the earth itself was breathing through me. The technique in my father's manual had a name, Stone Heart Foundation. A base skill, supposedly, the first step in a long chain of Duran bloodline abilities meant to grow over decades. Except when it activated in me, it didn't feel like a foundation. It felt like a ceiling coming down, like every wall in the building had decided simultaneously to demonstrate their opinion. The room survived, barely. 3 cracks in the floor, 1 collapsed support beam, a window frame that would never quite close again, no matter how many times the servants tried adjusting it. Oren Varek arrived within minutes, which told me he'd either been listening or he'd placed something in my room to detect exactly this kind of energy signature releasing without warning. He stood in the doorway, looking at the cracks, radiating from where I knelt on the floor, and his expression wasn't surprise at all. It was satisfaction, cold and precisely measured. "There it is," he said quietly, not to me, to the 2 senior Varek cultivators standing behind him in the hallway. "Document everything, measure the radius. I want an accurate report by morning." That night, I finally understood what the progress reports were for. That night, I finally understood the patience, the years of careful hospitality barely disguising something far more predatory underneath. The Varek clan hadn't taken me in because my mother remarried. They'd taken me in because they were waiting for my bloodline to manifest, and they intended to be there when it did. Stoneheart Foundation in the Duran lineage wasn't simply a cultivation base. According to the old manual, it was the key to something called the bedrock sovereign technique, the pinnacle of stone shaping. A cultivator who achieved bedrock sovereign didn't just command the earth. They became part of it, permanent and immovable, their spiritual core merging with the stone itself into something eternal. The Varric clan had been trying to replicate this technique for 3 generations without success, because it required a genuine Durin bloodline to serve as what the manual called an anchor catalyst. An anchor catalyst. I spent the following week reading and rereading that section of the manual, translating the archaic dialect as carefully as my 16-year-old attention allowed. The anchor catalyst, as far as I could understand, was a Durin bloodline cultivator who willingly, the manual stressed the word willingly 3 times in 3 different scripts, shared their core with another cultivator, allowing that person to piggyback the bedrock sovereign technique through the Durin bloodline connection rather than developing it independently. The word willingly was doing a lot of work in that description, and I was young enough to still believe it meant something significant, that no reputable cultivator would simply force it. I was 16. Optimism is perhaps the cruelest thing the universe gives children before it begins the long and thorough process of demonstrating exactly how wrong they consistently are. The training shifted after that night. Suddenly, I had a proper schedule, proper meals, a private training room with quality equipment, access to Varric clan technique manuals and spiritual stones. Orin himself began overseeing my sessions twice a week, patient and encouraging in a way he'd never bothered being during the previous 9 years of barely concealed contempt. "You have real talent, Kale," he told me one afternoon, watching me pull a section of floor upward without cracking it, a control exercise that had taken me months to master cleanly. "Your father would have been proud." He let that sit for a moment. I wonder sometimes if he understood what the Durin bloodline could truly become with the right guidance and support. I trained harder than I'd ever trained before because for the first time in 9 years, somebody was actually watching with something other than calculation or contempt, and I was hungry for it. Hunger is another thing the universe exploits ruthlessly. It plants it carefully, tends it with precise doses of what you've always needed, then harvests it at exactly the worst possible moment. The harvesting happened when I was 22. By then, I'd reached the 4th level of Stone Heart Foundation, a rate of progress the Varric clan's own record suggested was historically unprecedented. 4th level meant I could feel the earth for approximately 3 kilometers in every direction. A constant low awareness of pressure and density and the living weight of everything underground. It meant I could reshape granite without touching it, direct the movement of stone through intention alone, feel fault lines the way other people feel their own pulse, steady and inevitable. It meant I was, according to my own very proud and completely naive assessment of the situation, someone the Varric clan could no longer afford to treat carelessly without consequences. I was wrong about that too, though the mistake at 22 was at least more sophisticated than the mistakes I'd been making at 7. Progress, of a deeply unfortunate kind. The proposal came through my mother, because Orin Varric was smart enough to understand that direct requests from him carried the weight of everything that had come before them. She sat across from me at the dinner table one evening, hands folded, looking at me with an expression I recognized as the specific grief of a woman about to do something she knows is wrong. "Orin has a proposal," she said. "A formal alliance between the Durin bloodline and the Varric clan. You would serve as the foundation of a joint cultivation technique, the bedrock sovereign. In exchange, the Varric clan formally recognizes your inheritance, restores the Durin name to its original standing, and guarantees your position as co-patriarch alongside Orin himself." I looked at my mother's carefully folded hands, then at the barely touched food on her plate, then back at her face, and understood something cold and complete in approximately 3 seconds. She had not come here to present me with a choice. She had come here to present me with a framing, a way of describing something that would happen regardless, as though my participation were invited. What happens if I decline?" I asked, keeping my voice very level, the way you keep your hands very still when something venomous is close enough that sudden movement becomes the only mistake. My mother's eyes didn't meet mine. "Orin believes the Durin bloodline has been dormant long enough," she said carefully. "He believes certain old agreements regarding property and succession require revisiting. Property and succession, meaning the estate, meaning the manual, meaning everything my father had left that the Varric clan had spent 16 years waiting patiently beside, while I grew into usefulness. I said I needed time to consider it. My mother said I had until the next full moon, which was 11 days away, which was exactly long enough for me to understand there was no real option being offered. I spent those 11 days making copies of every page in my father's manual, hiding them in 6 separate locations across the estate grounds, wrapped in oilskin against moisture and time. I spent them practicing Stone Heart Foundation until my spiritual core ached with the effort, pushing myself beyond every limit the technique had previously allowed, desperate for any edge. I spent 3 of those nights lying awake staring at the ceiling, thinking about Orin's smile on the day he'd arrived, thinking about the word willingly underlined 3 times in the manual. On the morning of the 12th day, I walked into Oren Varrick's study, sat down in the chair across from his desk, and told him I would agree to the alliance on one condition of my own. The condition was simple. I wanted the ceremony performed in the main hall of the Duren estate, publicly, with witnesses from 3 neutral clans present to document the formal terms. Oren looked at me across his desk with the particular stillness of a man who has just been shown a move he didn't expect from a piece he'd assumed was purely decorative on his board. Then he smiled, and it was the same smile from the first day, the one that had never actually changed regardless of what words accompanied it across 15 years of careful theater. Of course, he said. Whatever makes you comfortable, Kale. This should be a celebration after all. The formal unification of 2 great bloodlines deserves proper witnesses and recognition. The ceremony was scheduled for 7 days later. I used those 7 days to send messages to the 3 neutral clans myself, inviting their senior elders specifically, naming my reasons carefully. The reasons I named were not entirely false. I framed it as a historic alliance between the Duren and Varrick bloodlines, which was technically accurate, if profoundly selective about implications. What I didn't write in those messages, what I couldn't write without showing every card I held, was that I needed witnesses present specifically because I didn't trust what the ceremony would do to me. The neutral clan elders arrived on the morning of the ceremony, 7 of them across 3 families, their presence filling the main hall with a gravity the Varrick clan visibly hadn't anticipated. Oren greeted them warmly. His warmth had a temperature today, slightly too high, slightly too controlled, the warmth of a man recalculating something significant behind an unchanged expression. The ceremony began at midday. I stood in the center of the hall on a formation of carved stone circles, the Duren family sigil cut into the floor in concentric rings around my feet. Oren stood opposite me, his senior cultivators arranged in a semicircle behind him, their combined spiritual energy already resonating at a frequency I could feel through the soles of my feet. The Duren bloodline and the Varrick clan, Oren announced to the assembled witnesses, his voice carrying the precise weight of a man who has rehearsed every syllable, unite today in purpose and practice. As anchor catalyst and technique recipient, Kale Duren willingly, he paused on that word with a fraction of a second too much emphasis, shares his core foundation with the Varrick cultivation path. I felt it the moment the ceremony formation activated beneath me, felt it in the same way I'd felt the earth for 3 kilometers in every direction, except this was directed inward. The formation wasn't drawing out my technique to share it with Oren. It was designed to extract it entirely, to pull the Stoneheart foundation out of my spiritual core like pulling a root from soil. The pain was not like anything I had prepared for, and I had prepared quite carefully because I had found a secondary page in the manual that described exactly this process and its effects. I had prepared for the extraction. What I had not fully prepared for was the speed, or the fact that 6 of the 7 neutral clan elders were standing perfectly still with closed eyes, not watching, not witnessing, participating, channeling their own spiritual energy into the formation beneath my feet, amplifying the extraction process by a factor I couldn't calculate clearly. The Varrick clan hadn't invited neutral witnesses to observe a fair ceremony. They had invited 6 cultivators who owed them favors to serve as amplifiers for an extraction they'd spent years planning. The 7th elder was genuinely neutral. I watched him stand up from his seat, his face going pale with what I recognized even through the pain as genuine outraged surprise. "This isn't an alliance ceremony," he said, loudly enough that his voice cut through the resonance of the formation. "This is a forced extraction. This violates every cultivation accord in existence." "Sit down, Elder Mura," Oren said calmly without turning. "Or be removed. This is a private family matter between the Duren bloodline and the Varrick clan, and you were invited as a courtesy." Elder Mura did not sit down. He took 3 steps toward the formation, and one of the 6 amplifying elders raised a hand in his direction, and that was the last I saw of Elder Mura staying upright. The extraction took 4 hours. I don't have clean memories of most of it, the way you don't have clean memories of things that are happening to the core of what makes you yourself. What I remember is the amber light draining from my hands. What I remember is the stone floor beneath me going quiet, the constant earth awareness fading to silence, the way hearing fades in deep water. What I remember is Oren Varrick kneeling beside me at some point, checking something at my wrist with professional efficiency, and then standing back up and saying 2 words without much weight. "He's empty." I remember thinking that was a strange way to describe a person, even a dying one. Then I stopped thinking for a while, which felt, if nothing else, like a reasonable response. What came next arrived in fragments. Cold stone beneath my cheek. Voices, Varrick voices, discussing logistics and the measured tones of people concluding a meeting that had gone more or less as planned. "The elder situation needs handling before word spreads," someone said. "Mura was already making noise before he went down. We have perhaps a day before his clan sends people asking questions." "His clan is 3 cultivators and a library," another voice replied. "Let them send people. By the time they arrive, the formation transfer will be complete, and this will be a settled matter. A settled matter. I was lying on the floor of my own family's main hall, listening to men discuss the timeline of my death with the same energy they'd use scheduling a cargo shipment. My spiritual core was empty. Without the Stoneheart Foundation anchoring my cultivation, my body had nothing to circulate spiritual energy through, nothing to maintain basic vitality functions. In a cultivator, that condition had a name, and the name was not something that came with recovery options, not after the kind of extraction I just experienced at the formation's full power. I had perhaps 6 hours, possibly fewer. I could feel the countdown in the same calm, certain way I used to feel geological pressure through the soles of my feet before the extraction. It occurred to me, lying on that stone floor, that I had been trying to be clever, and that cleverness against people who have been planning something for 15 years is a very particular kind of fool's errand. I had identified the betrayal. I had copied the manual. I had invited a witness. I had done everything a clever, careful person might do while fundamentally misunderstanding the scale of what was being done to me. The Varric clan hadn't spent 15 years waiting for my bloodline to manifest so they could negotiate with me. They had spent 15 years waiting so they could take everything, efficiently and completely. There's a specific kind of grief that arrives when you understand you were never a person in someone's story. You were an ingredient. The grief is very quiet and very thorough and very fast. Around the 3rd hour, when the Varric cultivators had mostly filtered out of the hall to begin the formal transfer process in another room, I managed to move my right hand approximately 6 inches. Not toward anything useful. The nearest wall was 20 feet away. My legs weren't responding yet. 6 inches of movement of one hand was not, by any objective measure, a strategic development, but the floor was still stone, even empty of technique, even hollowed of spiritual core, even dying with the quiet certainty of a man watching the last light leave a room he once owned completely. Even then, I was still Duren. The floor remembered, in the way stone always remembers, carrying weight and heat and the memory of everything that had ever pressed against its surface. The floor remembered my father's footsteps, remembered 16 years of my own training, early mornings and late nights, and every session where I'd pushed past the point of reason into something purer. It remembered the formation circles carved into it, the Duren family sigil in concentric rings, carved by hands that had been building towards something across generations before mine arrived to finish it. I pressed my palm flat against the floor and felt nothing. No amber light, no earth awareness, no 3-kilometer sense of pressure and density and the living weight of everything underground. Nothing except stone, cool and patient and indifferent. The way stone always is. The way stone is when it's waiting. The way my father used to say the earth always waits longer than anything living. The earth waits longer than anything living. He'd said that when I was 5, before the Varric clan arrived, before my mother remarried, before any of this required the specific kind of surviving I was about to learn. I thought about those words lying on that cold floor, and something in the empty space where my spiritual core used to be shifted, very slightly, like settling, like finding a different kind of ground. The Duren technique I'd spent 16 years practicing wasn't just a cultivation method. At its deepest level, which I had never reached, it was a description of what the Duren bloodline actually was. Stone shapers didn't draw power from the earth. The manual had said that, framed it that way, because that was the simple version, the version you gave students at the beginning. The real version, buried in the archaic dialect of the deepest pages, the pages I'd spent months translating with a scholar's dictionary and more patience than any teenager should need, said something else. The Duren bloodline didn't draw from the earth. The Duren bloodline was of the earth, an expression of it, something that had walked upright and learned to speak, but never stopped being fundamentally stone, which meant the Varric clan hadn't extracted my technique. They had extracted the conscious application of it, the shaped and trained and cultivated version, the tool without the material. The material was still here. The material was what I was made of, at the level that no ceremony formation could reach, because it wasn't spiritual energy at all. It was something older. I felt it coming in the 4th hour, the way you feel a tremor before it reaches the surface, the faint pre-announcement that something very large is about to change the shape of the ground. Not in me, under me, around me, through me. The Duren estate, the stone floors, the carved walls, the centuries of foundation beneath the building, all of it beginning to resonate at once. It was not a comfortable sensation. It was not a comfortable anything. It was the sensation of becoming, rather than simply being, and becoming at the level I was becoming is not a gentle process. I remember the floor cracking, not in the small controlled circle of my 16-year-old awakening, but everywhere, every direction, the cracks radiating outward like a breath finally released. I remember Varric cultivators running back into the hall, shouting, the formation circles shattering beneath the pressure of something their stolen technique had never accounted for correctly. I remember Oren Varric standing in the doorway, staring at me, and for the first time in 15 years, his face showed an expression I hadn't seen before, genuine and unguarded and unplanned. Fear. Pure, sudden physical fear. The kind that lives below cleverness and strategy and 15 years of careful patient planning. The kind that arrives when something much larger wakes up. The last thing I remember is Kael Duren, as a man, as something that breathed and thought and grieved the specific quiet grief of a person who was never an ingredient in anyone's story willingly. The last thing I remember is the stone floor rising around me like a tide, and thinking, with the clarity that sometimes arrives in final moments like an unexpected gift from a departing world. I thought, the earth always waits longer than anything living. And then I understood completely that I was no longer the anything living in that sentence. What came after was not darkness. Darkness implies an absence, a previous light that has been taken away. What came after was older than either of those descriptions, older than the words for them. What came after was stone, patient, and absolute and permanent, in a way that breathing things will never entirely understand, no matter how long they live or how much they cultivate. I slept. Not the way people sleep, not with dreams or the body's soft maintenance, not with morning waiting on the other side, like a contract the night is obligated to honor eventually. I slept the way mountains do, centuries at a stretch, indifferent to weather, indifferent to seasons, indifferent to the small warm things that build their temporary arrangements on the surface, indifferent to everything except the slow, enormous patience of something that has all the time that has ever existed, because it is made of the same material as time itself in the end. I don't know how long I slept before the first signs of what they were building reached me. Time for a mountain is not the same calibrated instrument it is for people who need to eat. I felt the weight first. Not unusual weight. Mountains feel all kinds of weight. The accumulated pressure of everything that has ever rested on the surface is simply the background of existence. This was organized weight. Weight with patterns, with regularity, with the particular rhythm of things being placed deliberately rather than settling naturally through erosion and accumulation. Foundation stones. I felt them as a faint, familiar pressure. Cultivators who knew their work choosing the flattest sections of my upper surface, the places where I had once been shoulders and chest. Then the weight of walls, then floors, then the organized hollow spaces of rooms and corridors, then the heavier concentrated pressure of towers pushing downward like slow, patient arguments. Occasionally I felt what I eventually understood were large ceremonies, many cultivators channeling simultaneously, the formation energy pushing downward through the building's stone foundations. Down into me, through me, using my petrified body as a spiritual energy conductor, a natural amplifier, the way certain mineral formations naturally enhance cultivation techniques in their vicinity. They had built a city on a stone shaper, and they were using that stone shaper as the foundation of their cultivation infrastructure, which was almost elegant if you didn't know what it was built on. I felt them growing stronger over what I slowly came to understand were decades. The weight above me increased. The formation energy increased. The organized, thriving pressure of a civilization in development. My enemies had not simply escaped consequence. They had prospered. They had built an empire directly on my grave, using my body as the bedrock of everything they became after taking everything I was. The particular irony of this is not lost on a being that has spent an indeterminate number of centuries with nothing to do except exist and very gradually understand what has been constructed above. At some point, the cultivation energy being channeled through me in their ceremonies began to do something the Varek clan's architects almost certainly had not planned for in their foundation designs. It began to wake me up, not quickly, not all at once, the way it had once awakened in a 16-year-old lying on a cold floor. This was the other kind of awakening, geological and inevitable. The kind that starts so far below the surface that no instrument of the people living above it will register anything unusual, until the process is already far too complete to interrupt. I had been asleep. I was becoming less asleep. The city above me continued its organized, prosperous, permanent-feeling life, completely unaware that the foundation was developing opinions. The first sensation I clearly identified as awareness, rather than simple geological existence, was warmth, the particular warmth of cultivation energy passing through stone that is no longer quite as inert as it appears. Then sound, transmitted through the stone in the way earthquakes travel, as vibration rather than air-carried wave. The compressed ghost of everything happening at the surface filtered through my own body. I heard festivals. I heard armies marching in formation, the organized percussion of disciplined feet on stone streets. I heard the celebrations of people who had never, not once, looked down. And then, in what I believe was the 743rd year of my sleep, though I confess my timekeeping had become somewhat approximate across those centuries of granite existence, something specific reached me through the stone, not a ceremony, not a festival, not the organized rhythm of an army, or the structural pressure of a new tower being added to what was built above. A voice, clear and direct and aimed downward with the kind of focused spiritual energy that suggested the speaker either knew exactly what they were doing or had stumbled onto something profound by accident. "I know you're in there," the voice said, pressing downward through 3 meters of my own petrified chest. "The geological surveys don't match any natural formation we've ever documented. Whatever you are, I found you." It was a young voice, female, with a particular tone of someone who has just confirmed a theory they've been arguing about for years with people who told them they were being ridiculous. And somewhere in the deep, slow, enormous patience of a mountain that used to be a man, something shifted, the way it had shifted on that cold floor 700 years ago against all reason. Not awakening, not yet, but the direction of something that was no longer moving towards sleep. The long, inevitable turn of something very large that has finally decided where it is going. I was remembering. Not quickly, not all at once, but in the gathering way that stone remembers everything it has ever held, with the certainty of material that does not forget, because forgetting requires softness. The Varric flag, the amber light draining from my hands, my mother's carefully folded hands at the dinner table, Oren's smile on the first day, unchanged across 15 years of patient theater. I was remembering. And the city above me, that prosperous, permanent feeling, 7 centuries established city, built on the body of the man those people had hollowed and discarded like an empty vessel. That city had no idea that what it had been built on was in the process of finishing the longest and most patient thing that was ever called, by anything still living, waking up. If you didn't see that ending coming, you haven't been paying attention to what the Earth does when it's finally done waiting. And neither has the Varric clan. Subscribe and don't miss part 2. The young woman's voice pressed downward through the stone a second time, and this time it carried the sharp edge of someone who hates being ignored by anything, including geology. "I've been studying the anomalous resonance patterns in this region for 4 years," she said, aimed at my chest with the focus of a surgeon rather than a geologist now. 4 years of people telling me the formation signatures were natural, that the spiritual energy amplification was just a function of the bedrock composition in this particular basin. But natural formations don't have a heartbeat. She paused after that last word, long enough that I felt the silence the way I felt pressure, as a physical thing with weight and direction. A heartbeat. I had not been aware, across the 740-odd years of my geological existence, that I still had anything resembling one of those to be detected. The body, it turns out, is stubborn in ways that even a stone shaper's technique cannot entirely reclassify. Some things continue regardless, patient and rhythmic and enormously inconvenient to hide. Her name, I would learn eventually, was Senavos. Scholar cultivator, junior researcher at the Academy of Formation Studies, professional outsider in an institution that loved its consensus. She had been assigned to study the Varric City Basin's unusual spiritual energy density as a minor research project, the kind institutions give junior scholars to keep them occupied and mildly quiet. She had spent the first year confirming what every previous study had confirmed. The basin had extraordinary natural formation properties that amplified cultivation techniques significantly throughout. She had spent the second year noticing that the amplification followed patterns, not random distribution across the basin as natural formations produced, but organized pulses with consistent intervals. She had spent the third year arguing with her department head, who had increasingly strong opinions about junior scholars drawing dramatic conclusions from what he called overanalyzed survey data. She had spent the fourth year alone, on personal time she'd saved in 3-week increments, conducting surveys in sections of the basin that official research teams had never bothered examining. The section she was currently standing above, pressing her spiritual energy downward through 3 meters of what everyone else called bedrock, was what had once been my left shoulder. I felt her cultivation signature clearly now, a sharp, precise, academically trained thing with more raw talent than the institution above her had apparently bothered properly developing. The Varric City Academy of Formation Studies, built as it happened on my lower spine, had produced excellent conventional scholars for 6 centuries by the straightforward method of suppressing anyone too curious. Senavos was very curious, the kind of curious that makes careful institutions deeply uncomfortable because careful institutions prefer questions that already have approved answers waiting. She pressed her palm flat against the ground above me, and I felt the warmth of it through 3 meters of petrified stone, which should not have been possible and absolutely was. "One more survey," she murmured to herself, pulling out an instrument I couldn't see but could feel, something that measured formation signatures with greater precision than standard equipment. The instrument found what she was looking for. The instrument always finds what she's looking for, because Senavos was the kind of scholar who calibrated her instruments to measure exactly the right thing. It found a structural signature beneath the basin's bedrock that matched no natural formation in any geological catalog the Academy had accumulated across its 600 years of earnest study. It found a signature that matched, quite precisely, the theoretical resonance pattern of a petrified, human cultivation core operating at a level the theoretical models had never expected to encounter outside speculation. "There you are," she said. with the quiet satisfaction of someone who has just proven 4 years of argument correct by the most definitive method available to a researcher. Evidence? She sat down on the ground directly above my shoulder, cross-legged with the comfortable familiarity of a person settling in for the kind of conversation that requires proper preparation. "I'm going to assume," she said, "that whatever you are, you can hear me through the formation resonance because the pulse patterns changed when I started talking directly downward." The pulse patterns had changed. I had not been aware of controlling them, but apparently consciousness, even geological consciousness, expresses itself in ways that sufficiently precise instruments detect. "I'm also going to assume," she continued, "that you've been down there a very long time and that you probably have a great deal of things you would like to express about that." She wasn't wrong about that. 740-some years of patient geological existence had produced, among other things, opinions, quite a large number of them, in fact. "I don't know if you can respond to me," Senna said, "but I want you to know that I'm going to find a way to bring you back up, whatever that means for something in your condition. And I want you to know one other thing, before I go back to the city to figure out what to do next." She paused, and I felt the pause as clearly as I felt formation pressure. "The flag flying over the main civic hall," she said carefully. "The red and gray one with the mountain sigil that's been there for as long as anyone in Varick City can remember. Someone should probably warn them about what's going to happen to it when you see it." She stood up, dusted off her knees, and walked back toward the city built on my body. The flag, a red and gray mountain sigil on fabric that had been flying above a civic hall built on my collarbone for centuries, representing the clan that had hollowed me out and thrown me away. I had not been thinking about flags during 700 years of geological sleep. Flags are not the kind of thing that occupies a mountain's extended attention in meaningful ways. But I was thinking about it now. The image of it arrived through Senna's words and settled somewhere in the growing warmth of returning consciousness with the particular weight of a long memory. Or in Varick's study, my mother's folded hands, the formation circles cracking beneath me, the amber light draining from my hands, while 6 cultivators I'd never met amplified someone else's theft. And a smile. Unchanged across 15 years of theater, the specific smile of a man who has already decided what he plans to do with your things, worn every day until the deciding was finished. The flag above what used to be my collarbone snapped in a wind I couldn't feel, representing people who had built their entire civilization on the assumption that the ground beneath them was simply ground. Somewhere in the deep, slow, patient gathering of something enormous that has finally identified a direction, I felt the first real sensation I had experienced as something other than stone in 7 centuries. Not yet movement, not yet intention. Something earlier than both of those, the thing that comes before intention when the entity forming it is large enough that intention itself takes time to assemble properly. The city above me continued its prosperous day, completely unaware, every flagstone and foundation block and carved pillar perfectly positioned on a surface that was in the process of deciding to be something else. The earth always waits longer than anything living. My father had told me that when I was 5, when waiting was still a virtue I was being taught, rather than a condition I was being sentenced to. I had waited 700 years. I was done waiting, and the Varick clan, descendant heirs of Oren Varick's theft, and his 15 years of theater and his settled matter, were about to receive the Earth's reply. Senevos returned the next morning at precisely the same time, which told me she was either a person of rigid habit or a person who had spent the night not sleeping and planning instead. Given what I knew of her character from a single conversation conducted through 3 meters of petrified stone, I suspected the second option considerably more than the first. She sat down above my left shoulder again, cross-legged, with the focused energy of someone who has arrived with a list and intends to work through it methodically, regardless of obstacles. "I spent last night reviewing the Varick City Historical Foundation surveys," she said, pressing her cultivation signature downward with that same precise surgical focus. "All 600 years of them. The earliest surveys, conducted when the first buildings were being established, describe an anomalous bedrock formation of unusual density and regular internal structure beneath the basin. The survey team at the time attributed it to a naturally occurring mineral concentration. This was the conclusion of 7 cultivators, 3 of whom were senior formation specialists." She stopped speaking, and I felt the specific quality of that silence, the deliberate breath before a sentence she had been building toward across several preceding ones. 7 senior cultivators looked at a petrified human being, and collectively decided it was an interesting rock. I want you to know that I find this professionally embarrassing on their behalf. Something in the deep, warming current of my returning consciousness shifted in a way that might, in a body that still breathed, have been described as a laugh, or at least the intention of one. "The surveys, after that first one reference, the anomaly less and less," Senna continued. "By the 3rd generation of surveys, it's a footnote. By the 5th, it isn't mentioned at all. Which is how you successfully impersonate geology for 700 years. You simply wait for the people noticing you to be replaced by people who only read the most recent summaries. I had not consciously chosen that strategy. Geological sleep is not the kind of sleep that permits strategy. But I appreciated her framing it as a deliberate choice rather than an accidental success. I also found something in the historical record that I want to ask you about directly, she said, and her voice had changed slightly, carrying the specific weight of something significant being approached with care. There is an account in the Varric clan's own historical archive, which I accessed by telling the archivist I was researching formation site selection methods for a curriculum paper which was technically not false. The account describes an incident approximately 743 years ago in the main hall of a structure that stood on this site before Varric City existed. The account is filed under the heading Territorial Consolidation and Bloodline Integration, which is remarkable phrasing for what the actual text describes if you read it carefully rather than administratively. Territorial Consolidation and Bloodline Integration. The Varric clan had filed the theft and murder of the last Duran bloodline heir under a heading that sounded like routine estate management paperwork. The account mentions a cultivation ceremony that resulted in what it calls a geological event of significant scale, followed by what it describes as the voluntary petrification of the ceremony subject. Voluntary petrification. Oren Varric, even in the historical record he'd controlled and filed himself, could not entirely let go of the word voluntary, apparently. Some habits run deep. I want to be very clear, Senna said, that I do not believe the word voluntary is being used accurately in that description. The account contradicts itself in 3 separate places on that specific point. She was, I thought, an exceptionally good reader of historical documents, which is a rarer skill than institutions generally advertise, since careful reading has an awkward relationship with approved conclusions. The subject of the ceremony is listed as Cale Duran, last heir of the Duran bloodline, age 22, stone shaper cultivator of the 4th level, Stoneheart Foundation technique. She let my name sit in the air above me for a moment, pressed down through stone toward whatever I was now, and I felt it arrive with the particular weight of something that has waited a long time to be spoken. Kyle, she said quietly, using it directly this time, if that's you down there, I want you to know that I found Elder Mura's account too. The real one, that he filed with his own clan before he died. Elder Mura, the 7th neutral witness, the one who had stood up, the one who had said this is a forced extraction and not sat down when instructed to, the one I had lost sight of on the floor. I had not known what happened to Elder Mura after that. I had not been in a condition to track the outcomes of other people's choices during the 4 hours. My spiritual core was being extracted against my will. He survived, Senna said. He was injured, but his clan reached him within 2 days and brought him home. He spent 40 years after that attempting to file formal complaints with every governing body he could reach. The Varric clan's response to each complaint was to present the ceremony as a voluntary alliance that produced an unexpected geological event, supported by the testimony of 6 senior cultivation witnesses. 6 of the 7 witnesses, Senna added, with the particular dryness of someone who genuinely respects precision and cannot quite suppress her feelings about people who weaponize it. Elder Mura died 40 years after the ceremony, having failed to achieve formal recognition. His personal record describes what he saw in considerably more accurate terms than any official account. She paused. I waited, the way stone waits, with the patience of something that has no appointment competing for its attention. He wrote that the subject of the ceremony, at the moment of complete core extraction, did not die in the manner the ceremony architects expected. He wrote that the ground opened, and the subject became the ground. He wrote that he believed the Duran bloodline's connection to the earth was not a cultivation technique that could be extracted by a formation. He wrote that it was something the formation did not know how to reach. He wrote that he believed Cale Duran was still alive somewhere beneath the basin, and that whoever built on this site in the future should be aware of what they were building on. The Varric clan's response to this section of his account was to have it classified as the trauma-induced speculation of a cultivator who had been incapacitated during a stressful ceremony. I spent a moment with that information, in the slow, deep way that I processed information now, which was not quick, but was thorough in the way that geological processes tend to be thorough. Elder Mura had known, had spent 40 years trying to tell anyone who would listen, had failed because the people most motivated to listen were also the people most able to ensure nobody else did. And then he had died, and his account had been classified, and the Varric clan had built their city on the site, in the confident knowledge that the only inconvenient witness had been thoroughly managed. They had not considered that the thing under the ground might eventually find its own way of filing a response. But then, the Varric clan had a consistent history of not considering me properly. I need to be honest with you about something, Senna said, shifting her position slightly above my shoulder. I'm not sure what to do with any of this information, practically speaking. If I bring Elder Mura's account to the Academy, they will classify it the same way the Varric clan did 7 centuries ago, because the Academy's funding comes significantly from Varric clan endowments. If I go to the civic authorities with my survey data and the historical evidence, they will ask the Academy to assess my methodology, and the Academy will ask the Varek clan to weigh in on the history. If I publish independently, I will lose my research position, my access to the formation archives, and my ability to conduct the kind of surveys that have any chance of actually helping you. She sounded frustrated. Not the explosive frustration of someone who has lost their temper, but the contained, precise frustration of someone who has mapped every available path and found each one obstructed. "So for right now," she said, "what I can do is talk to you, which seems to be doing something based on the resonance pattern changes I'm recording, and think, which I'm also doing constantly. I also want to tell you that the situation above you is not static. The Varek clan has been in a succession dispute for the past 11 years, since the current clan head has no direct heir. This was new information, and new information, after 7 centuries of geological repetition, had a particular quality of sharpness that I felt across whatever passed for my attention. There are 3 claimants," Senna continued. "Orin Varek's direct lineage ended 4 generations ago. The current candidates are cousins, each claiming the closest bloodline connection to the original founding family. The succession dispute has created significant instability in the city's governance structure. 2 of the 3 claimant factions are currently in what the official record describes as heightened competitive tension, which is how Varek City's civic record describes what outside observers would more directly call the fact that 2 of the 3 factions have been conducting low-level cultivator skirmishes for the past 3 years. Political fragmentation above me. The city my body had supported and amplified and sustained for 7 centuries was apparently in the process of fracturing along the seams its founders had never bothered reinforcing. There was something almost structurally appropriate about that, though I was aware that appreciating the irony was not the same thing as having a plan, and I was very much still in the process of assembling a plan. The assembling was going slowly because I was very large, and plans, like everything else that required intention and direction, took longer to form at my current scale than they had at human size. The most powerful of the 3 claimants," Senna said, "is a cultivator named Vel Varek, 43 years old, known primarily for having achieved the 6th level of the Bedrock Sovereign technique. Bedrock Sovereign. The technique they had stolen my core to power. The technique that had required the forced extraction of 700 years of my family's accumulated earth-shaping bloodline. Vel Varek had reached the 6th level of a technique built on the foundation of what they took from me, somewhere in his spiritual circuits threaded through with what had once been mine. I felt something in the deep warmth of my returning consciousness that was not patience. It was not quite the opposite of patience either, since I had 7 centuries of practice at that particular discipline. It was something more specific than either of those. The cultivator's sensation of identifying a target, the sense that had once let me feel fault lines through my feet. Vel Varek is currently leading what the civic record calls a unification campaign," Senna said, "which means he's trying to consolidate power over the other 2 factions before the succession issue is formally decided. He's doing this by positioning himself as the guardian of Varek tradition, specifically the founding family's cultivation heritage, specifically the Bedrock Sovereign technique and what he calls its natural home." Natural home. The site that had been my body for 7 centuries, described as the natural home of a technique that existed because of what had been done on that site to its actual owner. "He's planning a major public ceremony in 3 months, Senna said. A Bedrock Sovereign amplification ritual at the civic formation site, which is, as far as I can tell, roughly your chest." She paused again, and this time the pause had a different quality, the specific texture of someone who is being careful about how they say something because they believe it matters how you hear it. "If he conducts that ritual at full power with the current formation infrastructure amplifying it," she said carefully, "the resonance output will be approximately 7 times what the daily background level already is. And what the daily background level is already doing, Kale, based on my last 4 surveys, is accelerating your awakening process significantly faster than it would be progressing on its own. Accelerating my awakening." I sat with that, in the slow, comprehensive way I sat with all information now, turning it across every surface of my attention like examining stone for its structure. The Varek clan's planned ceremony to celebrate their stolen technique, conducted on my body, amplified through my own petrified form, was going to wake me up faster than anything else currently available. Orin Varek had spent 15 years planning how to use me. His descendants were apparently going to do the same thing, with the same result of catastrophically underestimating what they were working with. I had no particular objection to being underestimated. I had spent 31 years of human existence being underestimated, followed by 7 centuries of being mistaken for bedrock. I was familiar with the condition. "I have approximately 3 months to figure out what to do with this," Senna said. "And you have 3 months before full amplification either wakes you or does something I cannot predict. I would very much prefer it to be the former rather than the latter," she added. "If you have any way of communicating a preference on that point, I would appreciate hearing it. I considered how to communicate a preference through 3 meters of petrified stone, which is not a problem with an obvious solution even for a cultivator who once shaped granite with focused intention alone. The warming current of my returning consciousness had been building for what felt like weeks of accumulated awareness, the slow geological tide of something enormous shifting toward a direction it had chosen. I focused that current downward, toward the surface directly above where I felt Senna's palm pressed flat and pushed. Not outward, not in any direction that might affect the city above. Just upward, through 3 meters of what I was made of. One small, directed, intentional pulse of the thing that was assembling itself in the deep center of my returning existence. Senna went absolutely still. I felt the stillness through the stone, the sudden cessation of the small movements a living person makes continuously without noticing, breathing and shifting weight. Then, that was you. Not a question. The flat, precise statement of a researcher whose instrument has just done exactly what she hypothesized it would do, which is the purest form of scientific satisfaction. That was deliberate. You understood what I said and you responded to it. Another flat statement. She was cataloging, the way careful scholars catalog when they encounter something their models didn't fully anticipate. You understand me, she said again. And now something underneath her scholarly precision had shifted into something that recognized another person across a very unusual distance. I'll be back tomorrow, she said, and her voice had changed again, carrying now the specific quality of someone who has just committed to something they hadn't fully committed to before this moment. I'll have a plan by then, or the beginning of one. Plans at this scale take longer than I generally prefer, but I've had 4 years of practice at working with inconvenient timelines. She stood up. I felt her weight shift from sitting to standing, the small redistribution of a living person reorganizing their relationship with gravity. It was something I had not felt from the inside in 7 centuries, and it arrived with unexpected weight of its own. Then she walked back toward the city, and I watched her through the vibration she left in the ground, the particular rhythm of a person who is thinking hard while walking, which has its own distinctive cadence. I returned to the slow work of remembering and assembling. The 2 tasks were related, as it turned out. Memory, for something that had spent 7 centuries as stone, was not passive the way it is for people. Memory required the same focused intention that once let me redirect granite. It meant locating the impression left by an event in the material that had absorbed it, and drawing it upward. My father teaching me the word for bedrock in the old Duran dialect, which was also the word for patient, because the people who developed that language had considered the concepts inseparable. The feel of the training manual under my fingers, the scholar's dictionary beside it, the late nights with the hearthstone concealing what nobody else in the household cared enough to find, Orrin Varick's hand on my shoulder, the stone-pressed grip that had been the first thing I knew about him and the most honest. Because what he'd wanted from me, he had always wanted to take by force. My mother's face at the dinner table, her carefully folded hands. The grief of a woman doing something she knows is wrong, which is a particular kind of grief because it contains the option of not doing it. The formation circles cracking beneath me as something older than cultivation technique answered the question of what the Duran bloodline actually was in the only language available to it, which was geological. I was remembering with increasing clarity, and clarity in a being of my current dimensions had a quality that clarity in a human body did not, which was mass. It accumulated. It had weight. 7 days after Senavos's second visit, something happened in Varick City that I felt through the stone with the precision of a formation sensor rather than geological awareness. A skirmish. Not the low-level cultivator tensions Senna had described, the kind that left spiritual energy residue and some property damage and was officially classified as heightened competitive tension. This was larger. I felt it as a concentrated burst of formation energy in the district built on what had once been my upper chest, followed by structural damage to 3 buildings in quick succession. Then a second burst, larger, centered somewhere near what had been my right shoulder, with a directional quality suggesting it had been launched rather than accidentally discharged. A battle, then. One of the claimant factions had apparently decided that 3 months of formal succession process was a timeline that suited their opponents better than themselves. Senna arrived earlier than usual the following morning, and I felt the urgency in her footsteps before she reached her position above my shoulder, the particular rhythm of someone who has not slept again. There was a significant engagement between Velvarik's faction and the second claimant's forces last night, she said, sitting down with less of her usual deliberate settling and more of a controlled collapse. Approximately 40 cultivators involved, 16 buildings damaged. 2 of the 3 primary formation nodes in the civic infrastructure network were disrupted and are currently offline for repair. Formation nodes in the civic infrastructure network. I understood what those were now, with considerably more precision than I had when Senna first described them. They were anchored into me. The city's formation infrastructure, the network of spiritual energy nodes that powered the city's cultivation facilities and amplified the Varek clan's techniques, had been anchored into my body at the foundation level. which meant that when those nodes were disrupted by a faction skirmish, the disruption propagated downward, through the anchoring structures into the petrified form that served as their foundation. I had felt the engagement last night with more clarity than I'd felt anything in 7 centuries, because the nodes going offline had briefly removed the background resonance that usually filtered my awareness. In the absence of that background resonance, I had felt the city above me with sudden, startling precision, every building, every street, every cultivator, channeling energy through the infrastructure I constituted. I had felt Velvarek specifically, his cultivation signature threaded through with the resonance of Bedrock Sovereign at the 6th level, carrying my family's energy through circuits that were never meant to hold it. I had felt the flag, the red and gray mountain sigil of the Varric clan, anchored to its pole by a small formation bead that kept it from fraying in wind, positioned directly above the structure on my collarbone. I had felt all of this in the 3 minutes the nodes were offline, and in those 3 minutes, something in the slow assembling of my returning consciousness had accelerated considerably. The faction fighting is going to intensify, Senna said. I spoke to 3 independent sources, 2 inside the Academy. The consensus is that open conflict is now a question of when, not whether. Velvarek is accelerating his ceremony timeline. He believes completing the Bedrock Sovereign ritual before succession is resolved will give him enough power to simply end the dispute. He's moved the ceremony to 6 weeks from now. She paused. I want to be honest with you, Kale. 6 weeks is not enough time to build any institutional case for what's under this ground. It is also, she added, with the precision of a scholar who refuses to sugarcoat implications, the timeline in which a full amplification completes your awakening, whether either of us chooses that outcome or not. 6 weeks. The political fragmentation above me was accelerating the timeline from the surface, while my own returning consciousness accelerated it from below, and the intersection of those 2 timelines was 6 weeks. Senna pulled out her instruments and began her survey with focused efficiency, recording formation signatures and measuring pulse intervals. She worked with the particular care of someone against a deadline she doesn't fully control, mapping every resonance pattern available. When she finished, she sat quietly with the data, and I felt the quality of her silence, a very precise mind encountering numbers organized into an answer she wasn't quite ready for. Your awakening rate has increased by 37% since last week, she said. The disruption from last night's node failures seems to have accelerated the underlying process significantly. If the current rate continues, you will reach full consciousness approximately 2 weeks before Velvarek's ceremony. If the rate continues to accelerate, which the trend suggests it will, possibly sooner. Full consciousness. I turned that phrase over in my awareness with geological comprehensiveness, understanding it as a threshold rather than a destination, a line on a map rather than the territory it marked. Full consciousness was when I could begin to act, rather than simply feel and remember, slowly assembling intention from components available to something of my dimensions. I need to ask you something, Senna said, and her voice had the careful quality it got when she was about to ask a question. She'd been debating whether to ask for longer than the conversation had been happening. When you wake up fully, she said, when you can act rather than simply exist and perceive, what are you planning to do with the people above you? The question landed through 3 meters of stone and sat there. It was a fair question. It was possibly the most important question anyone had asked me since my father had asked, the morning after I manifested Stoneheart Foundation at age 16, whether I understood what I was. I understood what I was far better than I had at 16. I was Kyle Durin, last heir of a bloodline that had been stolen, murdered, and used as foundation for 7 centuries of prosperity. I was also a petrified entity of considerable size, beneath a city of 200,000 people, most of whom had been born after the original crime and had no personal involvement in it. I was also, less neutrally, a stone shaper who had spent 7 centuries absorbing and amplifying a stolen technique through my own body while the people above me became increasingly powerful at my expense. These were not contradictory facts, but complicated ones. Complicated facts require careful response, which is perhaps why being made of stone proves an appropriate condition for holding them. I pushed another deliberate pulse upward, this one more complex than the first, less a simple confirmation of presence, and more an attempt to communicate something with more structure to it. Senna went still again, then reached for her instruments, translating the pulse pattern into data with the focused attention of someone genuinely trying to understand rather than confirm. That was different from last time, she said. More complex. The intervals suggest you're communicating something structured, not just signaling presence. I'm going to keep working on translating it. What I can tell you, she added, is that whatever you're planning, consider the 200,000 people living above you who had no part in what was done to you. She was right about that, and I was aware that she was right about that. And I was also aware that being right about it and knowing what to do with it were 2 separate things, requiring separate work. The city above me had been built by the Varric clan on what they'd taken. But it had been inhabited for 7 centuries by people who had simply been born there, lived there, built their lives there. The city was not the Varric clan. The Varric clan was something smaller, a founding family that had spent 7 centuries becoming less than the thing it had originally created. The flag was the Varric clan. The formation nodes they used my body to power were the Varric clan. Velvarec and his bedrock sovereign technique in his succession campaign were the Varric clan. The butcher who had probably set up his stall on my left knee and sold mutton to the same families for 30 years. The scholar students arguing about formation theory in a library built between my shoulder blades. The children playing on the broad civic square on my chest, directly below the flag that Senna had mentioned with such careful precision. Those children were not the Varric clan. This distinction was not a small one. It was possibly the most important one available to something of my size and capacity, which had spent 7 centuries learning patience, taking careful aim. Senna left late in the afternoon with 4 hours of survey data and a promise to return the next morning with what she called the beginning of something that might eventually qualify as a plan. I spent the night accumulating awareness, extending perception through the stone, learning the city above me with the thoroughness of a cartographer who has only one chance to map the territory correctly. I learned where the Varric clan's clan hall was, the building on my sternum where Vel Varric currently conducted his succession campaign from a formal seat, built on what had once been the exact center of my chest. I learned where the formation infrastructure anchored into me most deeply. The primary nodes at 6 points across my body's surface, maintained by Varric clan formation engineers who visited them on a quarterly cycle. I learned where the flag was anchored, the small formation bead that kept it flying above the civic hall on my collarbone, 3 meters above the ground directly above the notch of my petrified throat. I learned the city with the attention stone gives everything, comprehensive and without preference, every district and building and formation node cataloged in the same continuous geological awareness. And then, in the early hours, before Senna's 4th morning visit, something shifted in the deep center of my returning consciousness that was different from anything that had shifted before. Not warmer, not faster, not more aware. Something else. The specific quality of intention fully formed, which in something of my dimensions was not a thought but a resolution, not a plan but a direction. The Varric clan had built their city on me. They had used my body as the foundation of their prosperity and their technique and their 7 centuries of accumulated power. They were going to find out what happened when a foundation decides it has been supporting the wrong structure for considerably longer than it intended. Senna arrived the following morning with dark circles under her eyes and a notebook that appeared to have been written in continuously since she'd left the previous afternoon. She sat down above my shoulder with the particular care of someone who is tired enough that deliberate movement requires conscious effort rather than automatic habit maintaining itself. "I have something," she said. "It's not a complete plan. It is a set of components that could, with the right sequencing, function as a plan's skeleton. I want to walk you through it and get your response." She opened her notebook and began. I listened with the complete attention of something that has been waiting 7 centuries for someone to speak to it as though it were worth speaking to. Outside the survey site, in the city that continued its oblivious, prosperous life above me, the Varric flag snapped in the morning wind, representing a clan that had never once looked down. They had never needed to. For 700 years, the ground had been perfectly cooperative, perfectly stable, perfectly silent about its opinion of the arrangement above it. The ground was developing an opinion and was about to express it. The ground, it turned out, had a great deal to say about everything that had been built upon it across 7 centuries. Drop a comment telling me what you think happens when Kale finally opens his eyes for real. And subscribe, because part 3 is where the ground stops waiting entirely. Senna arrived for her 5th visit with the notebook entirely full, and a second one already half covered, which told me more about the pace of her thinking than any direct statement could. She sat down with the careful deliberateness of someone who has been awake for most of the past several days, moving precisely to compensate for the imprecision exhaustion introduces. "I want to tell you what I've been working on," she said, "and I want you to pulse once if you understand, and twice if you have a significant objection. We'll build from there." I had been practicing the pulse communication in the hours between her visits, learning to modulate the direction and interval with more control than the first rough attempt had produced. I pulsed once, clearly, directly upward through the stone to the exact position of her palm, which she had learned to keep flat against the ground whenever she was speaking to me. "Good," she said. "First, I've identified the 6 primary formation nodes anchored into your body. I've also identified the 3 engineers who maintain them on the quarterly cycle. One of those engineers is a woman named Tova Rent, who has been filing quiet complaints about the formation infrastructure's unusual resonance patterns for approximately 12 years. She's been told those patterns are within normal parameters. She disagrees. She has continued disagreeing very quietly for 12 years, which takes a specific kind of persistence. I believe Tova Rent is someone who would listen to what I have to tell her. If I approach this carefully, She's a formation engineer, not a Varric loyalist. There's a difference. I felt the shape of what Senna was building toward with the slow, comprehensive attention I now brought to everything, the way stone examines what rests on it before deciding how to respond. She was gathering allies, people inside the city's own infrastructure who had noticed something wrong without having the framework to understand what they were noticing correctly. Second, she said, I've been reviewing the Varric clan's formation engineering records from the past 700 years, specifically the sections that describe the Foundation's unusual properties. There is a consistent pattern in those records that the engineers apparently never communicated to the clan leadership, possibly because they didn't want to alarm their employers. The Foundation resonance has been increasing at a gradual but consistent rate for the past 700 years. Every decade, slightly stronger. Every generation, slightly more pronounced. The engineers attributed this to natural mineral formation processes. They were wrong. What they were observing was you, Kale, slowly, across 7 centuries, waking up. The formation engineering records had documented my entire awakening process without recognizing what they were documenting, which had a quality of almost scholarly irony I appreciated. Third, Senna said, and her voice carried the weight of something she had been debating presenting, I found records of 3 previous incidents in Varric City's history that I believe are related. In each case, approximately 120 years apart, there was a significant geological disturbance in the basin, described in the official records as natural seismic activity. The timing corresponds to accelerations in the formation resonance pattern. I believe these were moments when your awakening process reached a threshold and then receded back. I considered that. 3 times, across 7 centuries, I had apparently come close to the surface and then sunk back, like a tide that doesn't quite reach the shore before retreating. I had no memory of these incidents. Whatever consciousness I had sustained across the centuries of geological existence was not the kind that filed experiences sequentially for later retrieval. But the pattern Senna described felt correct in the way geological patterns feel correct when you have spent enough time being geology, a confirmation of structure rather than a revelation of it. I think what's different this time, Senna said, is the combination of accelerating faction conflict disrupting the formation nodes, plus Velvaric's planned amplification ceremony. In the 3 previous incidents, the conditions weren't simultaneous. Either the resonance increased naturally, or there was formation disruption, but not both at once with this kind of intensity. This time both conditions are converging on the same timeline, and I think this time the threshold will be enough that retreating isn't going to be the outcome of reaching it. She paused, and I felt the pause as the particular silence of someone delivering a conclusion they've been working toward and are still deciding how to say the final part of clearly. What I want to tell you, she said carefully, is that I think you're going to wake up fully, regardless of what either of us chooses to do about the ceremony in 6 weeks. The process is past the point of natural reversal. What the ceremony will determine is not whether you wake, but what condition the city is in when you do. I sat with that for several slow heartbeats of returning consciousness, turning it across the same comprehensive geological attention that I had given everything since becoming capable of attention again. She was describing a binary outcome, a city that had been prepared for what was about to happen beneath it, with people warned, formation infrastructure carefully managed, evacuation routes identified, or a city that continued its prosperous, flag-flying, oblivious life above me until the morning, 6 weeks from now, when Velvaric's amplification ceremony completed the threshold I was already approaching. The difference between those 2 outcomes was not whether the Varric clan faced consequences. That part was not a variable in the calculation. That part was already a certainty. The difference was how many of the 200,000 people above me who had no personal involvement in what had been done to me were still standing when the certainty arrived. I need your help with something, Senna said. Not a plan, not yet. Something more specific. I need you to tell me if there's a way to access the formation node on your left side. The left shoulder node is the most isolated from the main infrastructure network. If I could temporarily deactivate it without triggering an alert in the central maintenance system, it would prove the concept. It would show Tova Rent that the formation infrastructure is responding to something inside the Foundation, not to natural mineral processes. It would give me something concrete rather than theoretical. She was right that concrete was more persuasive than theoretical, especially when the theory involved a 700-year-old petrified stone shaper embedded beneath an unsuspecting city. I focused on the node she was describing, felt its position against the outer surface of what had once been my left shoulder, felt the formation bead structure anchored into my stone body. Formation nodes in Varric City's infrastructure had been placed without the engineers understanding what they were anchoring into, which meant they had been anchored incorrectly by the standards of stone shaping. An anchor placed incorrectly in stone doesn't hold the way the engineer intends. It holds the way the stone allows, and the stone had been allowing this one to hold for 7 centuries as a courtesy. The courtesy, it occurred to me, with something that might in a different situation have been amusement, had not been intentional, but it could become intentional now. I focused my returning intention on the node, on the specific point where the formation bead's energy connection met my petrified surface, and I adjusted the surface by approximately 1 degree. Not moving, not shifting. Adjusting, the way stone adjusts when pressure changes, a reclassification of the relationship between two surfaces rather than a displacement of either. Above me, in the physical world of the city's infrastructure, a node that had been functioning continuously for 117 years went briefly, cleanly, entirely offline. Senna's instruments recorded everything. I felt her stillness, the complete cessation of small movement, the held breath of a researcher whose experiment has just succeeded beyond what seemed reasonable. "That was you," she said, and her voice was very quiet, with the specific quality of someone who has spent 4 years being told they were wrong and has just been shown without ambiguity that they were not. "You took the node offline from the inside, from underneath the anchor point?" She was recording as she spoke, her hands moving with practiced efficiency while her voice stayed very still. "Tova Rent is going to get an alert about this in approximately 20 minutes, she said. "I need to be in position to intercept her before she files an anomalous event report." She stood up with significantly more energy than she'd sat down with, the specific revitalization of a person who has just moved from theory into evidence and finds the change invigorating. "Put it back online when you feel me directly above the node again," she said. "That way the alert reads as a brief fluctuation rather than a sustained failure. It gives us more time." She walked quickly toward the city, and I tracked her movement through the stone until she reached the edge of the survey site and her footsteps joined the organized percussion of city streets. I waited, feeling the 20-minute countdown the way stone feels any interval, with patience that was no longer entirely geological and not yet entirely human, but something in the process between. Then I felt her, above the shoulder node, the distinctive, precise weight of a person sitting cross-legged with the flat-palmed attention of someone who has learned to communicate through ground. I adjusted the surface back by 1 degree. The node came online. The alert, if it had been generated, would read as a 17-minute fluctuation in a node with a 700-year clean record. Senna stayed above the node for another hour, recording, and I felt the second presence arrive beside her approximately 40 minutes in, heavier, with the specific weight distribution of someone in work clothing. 2 people, above my left shoulder, Senna and someone she had intercepted between the alert and the report, someone who had been quietly noticing anomalous resonance patterns for 12 years. I felt the vibration of their conversation through the stone, not words, but the rhythm of a careful explanation being delivered to someone listening with the quality of a person who has been waiting for exactly this. The second person stayed 20 minutes, then left. Senna remained for another hour, recording with the focused energy of someone who has just completed the first concrete step of a plan built entirely in theory. The theory had just become evidence. That particular transition, I understood, changes everything for a careful scholar. When she finally stood up to leave, she pressed her palm flat against the ground one more time, not in the survey position, just flat, as if acknowledging something that didn't require words to communicate. I felt the warmth of it, the small human heat of a living person's palm against 3 meters of what I had become, and I felt it with the same clarity and the same weight I gave everything now. She left. The city continued above me, prosperous and flag-flying and entirely unaware of the conversation that had just taken place in the survey site at its southeastern edge. Somewhere in the process of my assembling return, something had clarified in the way stone clarifies under consistent pressure, compressed into something denser and more definitive than it had been. I had been thinking about the flag, the red and gray mountain sigil of the Varric clan, the small formation bead that kept it flying through 7 centuries of wind above my collarbone. I had been thinking about Oren Varric's smile, unchanged across 15 years of patient theater, the smile of a man who has already decided what he plans to do with your things. I had been thinking about my mother's folded hands, the specific grief of a woman who chose wrong and knew it and did it anyway, which was a different kind of grief from the one she'd handed me. 6 weeks. The ground beneath an unsuspecting city was developing a plan to match its opinion with the patient thoroughness that stone brings to everything it considers worth considering. The Varric clan had built something on me. They were about to learn the difference between a foundation that bears weight and a foundation that decides it is done with bearing it. That distinction, which their engineers had been quietly noting for 7 centuries without understanding what they were noting, was about to become extremely clear to everyone above it. If you want to know what Tova Rent finds when she runs her own survey, and how close Senna is to running out of the time she needs, drop a comment and subscribe before the ground moves in Part 3. Tova Rent arrived at the survey site 2 days after the node fluctuation, and she arrived alone, which told me she had not filed the anomalous event report as procedure required. A formation engineer who does not file a required report has made a decision, and decisions made by people who have been quietly noticing something wrong for 12 years tend to be serious ones. She did not sit down the way Senna sat down. She stood, with the particular stillness of a professional examining something she's been trying to understand across a long career. Her cultivation signature was different from Senna's, less academically precise and more practically calibrated, the signature of someone who has spent years working directly with formation infrastructure. She pulled out instruments I recognized through the vibration they produced, heavier and more comprehensive than Senna's survey tools, the kind that formation engineers used for structural assessments. She ran 3 complete surveys in succession, which took approximately 2 hours, and I felt the precision of each scan as a directed pressure against my surface, professional and methodical. When she finished, she put her instruments away and stood very still for a long moment, looking at the data with the focused attention of someone who has just confirmed something significant. Senna Voss told me what she thinks is down here, Tova said finally, speaking downward with the directness of someone who has decided that if this is true, indirect communication is a waste of time. She told me about Kale Durin and the Varik clan, and 700 years of what she calls willful geological misclassification, which is a description I find diplomatically generous. She paused. I've been maintaining the formation nodes in this basin for 22 years. My predecessor maintained them for 31 years before me. We have both filed notices about the resonance anomalies. We were both told those anomalies were within normal parameters for a basin of this mineral composition. I have spent 12 years not believing that and not being able to prove it wasn't true. Your survey data proves it, Senna's voice said, arriving from the direction of the city. She had apparently planned to intercept Tova here after the surveys, rather than before them. The two of them stood above my left shoulder together, and I felt the combined weight of 2 people who had each spent years noticing something wrong, and had finally found each other. The structural signatures matched no natural formation in any reference catalog I have access to, Tova said, now addressing both Senna and whoever or whatever was 3 meters below her feet. The resonance pattern is organized with an internal logic that natural mineral formations do not produce. It follows the kind of spatial logic that cultivated formations follow, not geological ones. Which means, she said, with the precision of someone who has arrived at a conclusion carefully and intends to state it without softening, that this basin's foundation is artificial in origin. It's not artificial, Senna said quietly. It's biological. There's a difference. What's down there didn't build itself. It became this. That distinction matters for what we need to do next. I felt the weight of that distinction as something more than linguistic. The difference between a structure and a person. The difference between what can be managed and what needs to be communicated with. Either way, Tova said, the formation nodes anchored into it are compromised, not damaged. Compromised, which is a different problem. They're anchored into something that has the capacity to adjust them. Which it has been doing, Senna said, for 700 years, slowly, in ways that read as natural drift in the annual maintenance logs because nobody was looking for active adjustment. Tova was quiet for a long moment, processing the implications with the thoroughness of someone whose entire professional framework was in the process of being significantly revised. The amplification ceremony in 6 weeks, she said finally. Velvarik is planning to run it through all 6 primary nodes simultaneously, at 3 times the standard amplification rate. I know, Senna said. That's the problem. That's not the problem, Tova said. The problem is that I'm the engineer who would normally certify those nodes for a high amplitude ceremony. And you can't certify them, Senna said, because you know what they're actually anchored into. I can refuse to certify on grounds of anomalous resonance patterns, Tova said, which I've been documenting for 12 years, which means I have substantial evidence for the refusal. Velvarik will simply override my certification and run the ceremony anyway. He has the authority to override formation engineer certification for clan ceremonies on his own clan's infrastructure. The legal framework for that override has existed for 4 generations. I followed the conversation with the complete attention I now brought to everything happening above me, feeling the shape of the problem they were identifying with growing clarity. They could not stop the ceremony through official channels. They could not build an institutional case in 6 weeks against a clan that had been managing this narrative for 7 centuries. What they could do, and what I felt Tova beginning to calculate toward with the methodical patience of a professional approaching a structural problem, was something more specific. The 6 nodes don't all need to be online simultaneously for the ceremony to proceed, Tova said. Velvarik's engineers will tell him 4 is sufficient for the base amplification level. If 2 nodes are offline at ceremony time, he proceeds with 4, which produces approximately 40% less amplification than the full 6-node configuration would generate. 40% less amplification means the threshold effect on the foundation resonance is reduced by approximately the same margin. It doesn't prevent anything, it buys time. How much time? Senna asked. 2 to 3 weeks, Tova said. Possibly 4, depending on how quickly the underlying process is moving by the time of the ceremony. 2 to 3 weeks after the ceremony. Enough time? Potentially, to do what Senna had said the 6 weeks before the ceremony was not enough time to do. Build an institutional case, or enough time for something else, something that didn't require institutional channels or formal procedures or the cooperation of academic departments funded by Varric clan endowments. I focused a deliberate pulse upward, not the confirmation pulse I'd been using, but a different interval pattern, the one I'd been practicing across the hours between Senna's visits. Senna's instruments registered it immediately. "He's communicating something," she said. "The interval structure is different from the confirmation pattern. Tova, record this." I sent the pattern twice more, slowly, giving them time to record the intervals between pulses, with a precision that would allow meaningful translation rather than interpretation. 3 pulses, pause, 2 pulses, pause, 1 pulse, Tova said, reading from her instrument. "Is that a countdown, a sequence, something else entirely?" It was neither of those. It was the closest approximation I could produce, through stone and interval and the limited vocabulary available to a geological entity communicating with pulse patterns, of the word ask. "Ask," Senna said quietly, and the certainty in her voice told me she had understood, the way a careful scholar understands things, by eliminating every other interpretation first. She pressed her palm flat. "You want us to ask you something rather than plan around you. Not a question, a translation." "What do you want us to ask?" I had spent 2 days preparing for this conversation, which in human terms would be considered excessive preparation for a short exchange, but I was not currently operating on human terms. What I needed them to understand was that they were approaching this problem as people who were trying to protect something, which was admirable, but which was not the primary variable. I sent a longer pattern. 12 pulses in a specific interval structure I had practiced until I could produce it without variation. The pattern I had decided would mean not protect, use. "Not protect," Senna said slowly, testing the translation. "Use." She paused. "You're telling us you don't need protecting. You're telling us you can be used, directed towards specific targets." I pulsed once. Confirmation. The slow, enormous intention that had been assembling in my returning consciousness across weeks of careful construction had found its shape. I was not a victim waiting to be rescued by 2 scholars who had found the right historical records. I was a stone shaper who had spent 700 years becoming something considerably larger. The question was not whether I would wake up. The question was whether, when I did, the necessary targets were still where they needed to be for what came next to have the precision it required. Tova sat down. I felt the shift in her weight, the decision being made at the level of posture before it was made at the level of words, a person choosing to participate rather than simply assist. "Velvarek," she said. "The clan hall on the city's central platform. The flag anchor above the civic structure. The 6 formation nodes, and presumably something involving the main ceremony site. And the succession dispute claimants who are not Velvarek," Senna added. 2 other factions who had been fighting him for 11 years and would potentially consider an alliance of convenience. They were building the target list with the focused efficiency of people who have realized that their role in this situation is not to manage it, but to aim it, which is a considerably more useful role. "I need to know one thing," Tova said, pressing her palm flat in the posture she had apparently adopted from Senna during their time above my shoulder. "When you wake up, is it controllable?" A fair question. A necessary question. The question that determined whether what they were planning was collaboration or simply standing near an event and hoping the damage pattern was acceptable. I thought carefully about how to answer it, not because the answer was uncertain, but because the answer required more precision than a confirmation pulse could carry. I sent a pattern I had not used before, one I had been constructing across the past week. 3 intervals that I intended to mean here, not there, and them, not everything. "Precision," Senna said, translating not from the pattern, but from what she knew of the situation, the way a careful scholar sometimes understands the answer before they've decoded the form it arrives in. "He's telling us it's precise. Not a collapse, not an earthquake, not 700 years of stored geological pressure releasing in every direction simultaneously." She paused. "A stone shaper," she said, more quietly. "Not a geological event. A cultivator who has been practicing stone shaping for 700 years and has become the stone he's been shaping." Tova was silent for a moment. "Then we need to make sure the right things are in the right places at the right time." "Yes," Senna agreed, "and we have 6 weeks to arrange that." 5 weeks and 4 days, Tova corrected, with the precision of a formation engineer who has never in her life been comfortable with approximations when accurate numbers were available. They worked out the beginning of a plan above my left shoulder, the 2 of them speaking quietly and efficiently, their voices filtered through 3 meters of stone as organized vibration. I felt the structure of it assembling, not in detail, but in the way stone feels the structure of whatever is being built on its surface before the building is complete. The weight distribution, the balance. What they were building was not simple. It required Tova to take specific node maintenance actions that would be defensible as standard engineering decisions, but would have non-standard effects. It required Senna to reach the two non-Velvarek succession claimants and communicate, without triggering Velvarek's intelligence network, what was about to happen beneath the city they were competing over. It required timing, with the precision that formation engineers and careful scholars both appreciated for different reasons, the ceremony as the fixed point around which everything else organized. "There's one more thing," Senna said when they had covered the main structure. "The 200,000 people who aren't Velvarek, who aren't the Varek clan, who are just people living here." "I know," Tova said. "That's why the node management matters. The difference between the ceremony proceeding at full amplification and at reduced amplification is the difference between sudden and gradual." "Gradual can be evacuated," Senna said. "Sudden can't." "Gradual gives people time to understand what's happening and move away from the areas with the heaviest formation anchor density." "Which are?" Senna asked. "The civic platform," Tova said. "The clan hall, the ceremony site, the eastern financial district, which my surveys placed directly over the chest area." "The chest area, the civic platform on my sternum, the clan hall on the center of what had once been the center of me, where Velvarek conducted his succession campaign from a formal seat. The flag above my collarbone, anchored by its formation bead, representing 7 centuries of a family that had never looked down at what they'd built their entire world on. 3 days after that conversation, I felt something new in the city above me, the particular organized energy of a significant gathering, not a ceremony, not a skirmish, but a meeting. The meeting was in a building I had cataloged as belonging to the second succession claimant, a structure on my lower back that I had assigned a lower priority in my developing understanding of the city's layout. 2 cultivation signatures I didn't recognize, plus Senna's precise academic presence, plus a 4th I had cataloged as belonging to Tova. 4 people in a room, not on Velvarek's territory. I could not hear what was being said. I could feel the quality of the meeting through its duration and the rhythm of the energy signatures, the specific texture of a serious negotiation being conducted carefully. It lasted 3 hours. When it ended, Senna walked back toward the survey site, and I felt the quality of her footsteps, the particular cadence of someone who has accomplished something difficult and significant. She sat above my shoulder without her instruments, which was new, the first time she had come here without the professional apparatus of her academic work, just herself and her palm flat on the ground. "The second and third claimants have agreed to a conditional alliance," she said. "Conditional on what I described as a significant change in the city's structural situation in approximately 6 weeks. They didn't entirely believe me about what that change would look like. I described it as a geological event of significant historical precedent. They decided the conditional alliance was worth the uncertainty. They're going to begin moving their people and assets away from the civic platform and the clan hall district over the next 4 weeks, framing it as routine reorganization to avoid alerting Velvarek. Tova has filed for scheduled maintenance on the north and east formation nodes, citing the 12-year anomalous resonance documentation. The maintenance window falls exactly 3 days before the ceremony. During scheduled maintenance, nodes go offline for recertification testing, standard procedure. Nobody questions it." She paused. "Nobody has ever questioned Tova's maintenance filings in 22 years. So on ceremony day, Velvarek will have 4 nodes, not 6, 40% less amplification. The threshold effect will be reduced, and what would have been sudden will instead be gradual." She paused, long enough that I felt the pause as the specific weight of something she was deciding whether to say directly or approach more carefully. "Kyle," she said, using my name the way she had the first day, with the quality of someone speaking to a person rather than a phenomenon. "I want to ask you something directly. When you wake up fully, and when you do what you're going to do, there is one thing I need you to promise me. Not because I think you've forgotten, because I need to hear it stated. The flag," she said, "the clan hall, Velvarek, and the succession ceremony, and 700 years of consequences built up to a single specific morning. All of that, I understand. But the butcher on your left knee, the scholar, students in the library between your shoulder blades, the children in the civic square," she pressed her palm harder against the ground. "They are not the Varek clan. They are people who happen to be born on top of what was done to you. I need to know that distinction is the same for you as it is for me." I sent the pattern meaning, "Here, not there. Them, not everything." Then I added a pulse I'd been considering for days, something more specific than simple confirmation could carry. A long pulse, slow and deliberate, followed by 3 short ones in quick succession. The rhythm of something patient finding its direction. The rhythm I hoped of a promise. Senna stayed very still for a long moment after that. Then, "I believe you." She said it simply, with the particular certainty of someone who has been reading ground for 4 years and trusts what it tells them. She stayed for another hour, telling me what the city looked like from the surface level, the things her surveys couldn't capture, the way the morning light fell across the civic square, the way the flag moved in the wind that came down from the northern ranges every afternoon, red and gray against the sky, the mountain sigil of a clan that had never looked at anything beneath them, the way the formation node maintenance crews moved through the city, unhurried, familiar, 4 generations of engineers who had learned their craft from predecessors in an unbroken line. She described the clan hall, which I had never seen, which had been built 200 years after my death on a spot I had not been conscious to observe, rising 3 stories above my sternum. She described the ceremony site, a formal platform built above my chest's center point, where the formation nodes converged and where Velvarek intended to conduct his amplification ritual in 37 days. The ceremony site has banners, she said. Red and gray, the mountain sigil, one on each of the 4 pillars, and the main flag above the entrance, larger than the Civic Hall one. Better positioned. Better positioned. I felt something that was not quite amusement and not quite anticipation, but occupied a space between those 2 responses, where certainty and intention meet and become something else. 37 days. The succession dispute above me continued its intensifying pattern, factions maneuvering against factions, the political arithmetic of a clan fracturing under its own accumulated weight. Velvarek was not fracturing. Velvarek was consolidating, with the focused aggression of a man who has identified a deadline and intends to be the only power standing when it arrives. I felt his cultivation signature moving through the city at irregular hours, the specific bedrock sovereign resonance that carried my family's stolen energy in circuits that had never been designed for it. He visited the ceremony site frequently in those 37 days, and each time I felt him standing above the formation node convergence on my chest, I felt the resonance of what he'd taken through me. Not quite pain. The original extraction had happened 7 centuries ago, and 7 centuries of geological existence had produced a significant recalibration of what I experienced as sensation. But recognition. The specific sensation of identifying something that had once been yours, now worn by someone else in a way that doesn't quite fit, the way a stolen coat always looks wrong on the thief. On the 22nd day before the ceremony, something changed in the quality of my awakening that I had not anticipated, and that Senna's instruments registered before she arrived the following morning. The awakening had been gradual and accelerating, then accelerating with a specific quality of something approaching a tipping point in the way geological processes approach tipping points. On the 22nd day, it crossed a threshold that I felt not as an external change, but as an internal one, the difference between assembling an intention and having an intention fully assembled and ready. I was not yet awake in the full sense that Senna had described as the outcome of Velvarek's ceremony, but I was no longer the geological entity I had been 3 months ago when she first pressed her palm to the ground. I was something in between, something the old manual described with a word translating roughly as the moment before the stone answers, which the Duran dialect treated as its own state of being. Senna noticed the change before her instruments confirmed it, telling me that whatever she'd developed across 4 years of reading ground had reached beyond the professional into something more fundamental. Something changed, she said, sitting above my shoulder with her palm flat. In the last day or so, the pulse patterns are different, the resonance is different, you feel different. I sent her the word I'd been building for several days, a pattern more complex than anything I'd attempted, 8 intervals in a specific structure meant to communicate something close to ready. She translated it in 4 attempts, the 4th one arriving at an accuracy that satisfied the patient geological certainty now occupying the space where uncertain intention had lived before. Ready, she said, 17 days early. The ceremony is still 22 days out, and node maintenance isn't scheduled until 3 days before that. She paused, processing this carefully. I sent the confirmation pulse. Then I sent a second pattern, shorter, the one that meant not yet. Meaning ready was the state, but ready was not the same as now, and now was not yet the correct answer. You're ready, but you're waiting, Senna said. For the ceremony? I sent a negative pattern, 3 quick pulses that she had learned meant no or not quite. For something specific about the ceremony? I sent the pattern that meant them, not everything. Then the long pulse and 3 short ones, the rhythm that was the promise. Then the word I'd built for here, not there. You're waiting to make sure the distinction holds, she said quietly. The ceremony gives everyone a known point. When the ceremony starts, the Nonvaric people who need to move will have already moved. The clan hall and the ceremony site will have the right people in them and the wrong people somewhere safer. She understood it now, completely, the way she understood things after 4 years of careful accumulation. The ceremony is the organizing point, she said. Everything else orients around it. The node maintenance, the claimant repositioning, the evacuation framing. The ceremony is what makes the timing knowable. I sent confirmation, Then a longer pattern I had been building since the second week of our conversations, since Senna had first said my name into the ground and waited to see what I would do. It took her several minutes to translate, working through the intervals with the same patient precision she brought to everything, and when she arrived at the translation, she stayed very still for a long time. "Thank you," she said finally, with the particular weight of someone who has just been told something they will carry for the rest of their life, and have already decided the carrying is worth it. I had told her, in the limited vocabulary available to a geological entity communicating through stone, the thing that had been true since the first morning she pressed her palm to the ground. That someone had finally noticed I was there, that the noticing had mattered in ways that 7 centuries of patient geological existence had made it impossible to fully anticipate. That the Earth, which always waits longer than anything living, sometimes finds that what it was waiting for turns out to be a scholar with precise instruments and 12 wrong translations before the right one. 22 days. The flag above my collarbone snapped in the afternoon wind from the northern ranges. The clan hall on my sternum cast shadows across the civic square in the long evening light. Below all of it, in the patient certainty of stone that has found its direction, something weighted with the specific quality of waiting that knows exactly when it is going to stop. Whatever you think is going to happen when that ceremony starts, I promise you haven't imagined it correctly yet. Drop your prediction in the comments and subscribe before part 4 arrives. On the 15th day before the ceremony, Velvark made a decision that I felt through the formation nodes as a directed pulse of cultivation energy across his entire domain. He was accelerating again. Not the ceremony timeline, which was fixed to the Succession Council's calendar and could not be moved without political cost. He apparently wasn't willing to pay. Something else. The skirmishes against the other 2 factions, low level for 3 years, suddenly intensified with the organized aggression of a man resolving multiple problems at once. Senna arrived that morning at a near run, her footsteps carrying the rhythm of someone who has just received information that rearranges their existing plan significantly. "Velvark attacked the 3rd claimant's compound last night," she said, settling with less than her usual care. "Significant casualties. The 3rd claimant has retreated to the outer districts. The 2nd claimant is consolidating their people in the northern quarter, which is away from the civic platform, but also away from the evacuation routes we discussed with them. Tova says the attack was conducted using Bedrock Sovereign technique at the 5th level, amplified through the civic formation network, which means he used your body as a weapon platform. He had used my body as a weapon platform. I held that information with the specific quality of attention that stone gives to things placed on it with intention, comprehensive and without rush. The Succession Council has called an emergency session for 10 days from now," Senna said. "If Velvark can consolidate the council vote before the ceremony, he doesn't need the ceremony at all. He's trying to run 2 timelines simultaneously. The military consolidation to force the council vote, and the ceremony to give him enough power that the vote becomes irrelevant if it doesn't go his way. Which means we have 10 days until the council session, not 22 days until the ceremony, and the plan we built around the ceremony as the fixed organizing point needs adjustment." I felt the specific challenge of what she was describing, a deadline inside a deadline, the shorter one capable of making the longer one irrelevant, depending on how the council session resolved. I sent a pattern, not one I'd used before, 6 pulses in a specific interval that I had built as a way to communicate something close to wait, the specific weight of something already in motion. "You're not worried about the council session," Senna said, translating with the ease that had developed across our weeks of conversation, "because the ceremony outcome supersedes it." I sent confirmation. "Regardless of how the succession vote goes," she said slowly, "what happens at the ceremony changes the context. A Succession Council decision made on top of you is still made on top of you, and whatever happens at the ceremony is going to change what that decision is built on." She paused. "I keep forgetting that your timeline is longer than mine. You've been thinking about this for centuries. 700 years is significant time for any problem to settle into clarity. Velvark's political maneuvering was less relevant than the fixed points around which everything else organized. The formation nodes, the ceremony site on my chest, the flag above my collarbone. These were the fixed points, and around them everything else was arrangement rather than structure. Tova is proceeding with the maintenance filing," Senna said. "The council session complicates things because Velvark may accelerate the ceremony if the session doesn't resolve in his favor. But Tova's maintenance window is filed and documented and would require specific Succession Council authorization to override, which Velvark doesn't currently have and won't have if the session goes against him." She thought for a moment. "If the session goes in his favor, he might delay the ceremony as a show of confidence, which would actually give us more time for the non-Varric populations to reposition. If it goes against him, he accelerates, but the node situation is already in place by then." She paused. "I think the plan holds. I think we're still organized around the right fixed points." I sent the confirmation pulse, then the long, slow, and 3 short pattern that was the promise, and she received it with the quiet acknowledgement of someone who already knew it was coming. That evening, alone in the survey site with no visitors scheduled, I did something I had not done since the first weeks of my returning consciousness, when I was still learning what I was capable of. I extended my awareness deliberately, not in the gradual geological way of accumulated perception, but with focused intention, the way I had once focused Stoneheart Foundation in the Durin Estate training room. I extended it upward, through the layers of city infrastructure and building foundation and street pavement, past the formation nodes and the organized structural weight of 7 centuries of building, up into the civic square on my chest, where the children played in the afternoon light, and the flag above my collarbone snapped in the evening wind from the northern ranges. I held that awareness carefully, with the precision that 700 years of practice produced in something that had once struggled to hold a simple control exercise without cracking the floor. I was learning the city the way I had once learned the estate grounds, every corner and passage, every resident who moved through it with the daily familiarity of a life built in one place. The butcher, on what had once been my left knee, closing his stall for the evening with the routine efficiency of someone who has done the same thing at the same hour for 30 years. The scholar students in the library between my shoulder blades, arguing about formation theory in the energetic, imprecise way that students argue about things they have read but not yet tested. The formation maintenance crew on their evening round, checking the nodes on their standard schedule, Tova's precise professional records, guiding them through the same route for 22 years. The flag, red and gray and steady in the evening air, the mountain sigil of a clan that had spent 7 centuries building a world on the assumption that the ground beneath them was simply ground. I held all of it, the entire city, in the extended awareness of something that had been practicing this kind of attention for 7 centuries without quite understanding that was what it was doing. And I felt, for the first time since becoming what I had become, the specific shape of what was about to happen with the clarity that only arrives when preparation and readiness finally coincide. Not yet. The promise held. The distinction held. The 15 days between now and the ceremony would be spent as they needed to be spent, in careful maintenance of the conditions that made precision possible. But I could feel the shape of it now, the way you can feel the shape of a stone beneath your hand before you've committed to moving it, the weight and balance and the direction of the intention. The Varric clan had spent 700 years not looking down at what they'd built on. In 15 days, they were going to discover that what they'd built on had spent that entire time looking up. If you've been waiting for the moment the stone finally answers, Part 4 is that moment. Subscribe and drop a comment telling me what the first thing Kale does with his eyes open will be. The morning of the ceremony arrived the way significant mornings arrive in stone, not with announcement or drama, but with the quality of something that has been patient finally finding its moment. I had been awake, in the full sense of the word, for 11 days before the ceremony. Not the partial wakefulness of returning consciousness, not the gradual warming of geological awareness, fully awake. Every part of me, from the bedrock of my feet to the surface of my shoulders, conscious and present and aware of every building, every street, every person above me with complete clarity. 11 days of being completely conscious inside a mountain that had once been a man, watching a city prepare for a ceremony that was going to become something entirely different from what it expected to be. Sen had known the moment it happened. She had arrived that morning at the survey site and pressed her palm to the ground and gone completely still for approximately 30 seconds. "You're awake," she said. Not a translation, not a question. The simple recognition of something she had been calibrating toward for months suddenly arriving with the unmistakable quality of presence. I sent the confirmation pulse, and even the pulse was different now, carrying a directness and precision that weeks of practice had built toward but the final awakening had completed. "How long?" she asked. 3 hours, I communicated in the vocabulary we had built together, the pattern language of intervals and rhythms that had become the most honest conversation I'd had in 7 centuries. She processed that quietly. "The ceremony is in 11 days. Everything is in position. Tova's maintenance window opens in 8 days. The second claimant's people are already repositioned. The third claimant's forces retreated to the outer districts after Velvaric's attack, which actually put them in better position than the original plan placed them. Distance is protective. There are approximately 14,000 people in the high-density districts directly above the formation node convergence zone," she said. "That number has been decreasing for 3 weeks. Market day is in 5 days. A significant portion of the civic platform population will be in the outer market district that morning for the seasonal trading assembly. Timing is good." She was being systematic and calm, which was not the same thing as being unafraid. And I understood the difference because I had spent 7 centuries learning to read what things contained beneath their surface. "I need to ask you one more thing," she said. "And I want you to know I'm not asking because I doubt the answer. I'm asking because asking is how I know I've done my preparation correctly. The distinction still holds?" I sent the promise pattern, the one she'd received the first time and had been receiving consistently across 11 days of full wakefulness. Good, she said simply. Then she sat quietly for a long time, which was different from her usual survey sessions, the silence of someone who has completed something and is resting in it. I want to tell you something, she said finally, and I want you to know it's not part of the plan. It's separate from the plan. It's just something I want to say before the plan becomes the only thing that matters. You were a person, she said. Before all of this, before 700 years and before what they did to you. There was a 22-year-old reading a manual in his room with a loose hearthstone. And whatever happens in 11 days, whatever comes after it, I want you to know that the 22-year-old in that room mattered. Not the stone shaper at the 4th level, not the foundation of a city, the person. I held that for a long moment in the way I now held things, with the complete, unhurried attention of something that had learned patience at a geological scale and found it transferred to smaller things intact. Then I sent a pattern built specifically for this moment. 8 intervals in the rhythm of something that had almost forgotten it was possible to be recognized by someone who was actually looking. It took Senna 3 attempts to translate it. The 3rd attempt was correct. She stayed very still after that, with the specific stillness of someone who has just received something they will carry a long time. You're welcome, she said quietly. And then she left, and I understood she was going to spend the 11 remaining days doing what careful scholars do before something significant, checking everything twice. The 11 days passed with a particular quality of time that moves at the rate of preparation, each day consumed by the specific task assigned to it, none of them wasted or slow. Tova conducted her maintenance window on day 8, taking the north and east nodes offline for recertification testing, filing the paperwork with the methodical precision of 22 years of professional habit. The alert went to Velvarik's engineers, who cleared it without escalation, because Tova Rent's maintenance records had never once given anyone a reason to escalate anything in 22 years. The second claimant sent a message on day 9, confirming their forces were positioned in the northern quarter and outer districts, asking when to expect the geological event, as they put it. Senna replied that they should expect it on ceremony day, and that their primary concern should be keeping their people away from the civic platform and the formation node convergence districts until further notice. On day 10, the Succession Council met for its emergency session. Velvarik arrived with sufficient political support to achieve a narrow council majority, which he declared a provisional succession authorization. Not a final vote, not enough to end the dispute formally, but enough to give him the institutional standing to conduct the ceremony as the provisionally recognized clan head, rather than simply a claimant. He declared the ceremony would proceed as scheduled. He declared it would be a demonstration of the Varik clan's unbroken 7th century heritage. He declared it would mark the beginning of a new era. He was not wrong about that last part, though the new era he had in mind and the new era that was actually approaching had limited overlap in their defining characteristics. I spent day 10 and the first hours of day 11 doing something I had not done in 7 centuries, extending my consciousness upward all the way to the surface and simply looking. Not surveying, not cataloging. Looking in the sense that a person looks at something they want to remember, with the specific attention of someone who knows what comes next and wants to be clear about what comes before. The morning light on the civic square, long and golden and falling across the stone pavement in the way morning light falls on stone, which is the most patient and honest relationship light has with anything. The flag above my collarbone, red and gray, the mountain sigil of the Varik clan in the first light of the ceremony morning, snapping once in the early wind and then hanging still. The clan hall on my sternum, its 3 stories casting morning shadows eastward, the formal seat where Velvarik had conducted his succession campaign positioned precisely on the center of my chest. The ceremony platform, 4 pillars with red and gray banners, a formation node, convergence point at its center, Varik clan engineers already present making final preparations for the amplification ritual, and Velvarik, standing at the ceremony platform's edge, looking out across the city that bore his family's name, his cultivation signature carrying the specific bedrock sovereign resonance at the 6th level, the resonance that carried my family's stolen energy through circuits that had never been designed for it, wearing the amber warmth of the Duren bloodline like a coat taken from someone who no longer needed it. He was a cultivator of genuine ability, I acknowledged with the fairness that stone gives everything it examines. He had built on what was taken, yes, but he had built seriously and with real skill. It changed nothing about what was going to happen. But acknowledging it felt correct, in the way acknowledging the weight of something correctly is always more accurate than dismissing it entirely. The ceremony began at midday, exactly as scheduled, as if this were a day like any other in 700 years of Varik clan ceremonial tradition, built on a foundation they had never examined. Not because I couldn't have moved earlier, not because 11 days of full wakefulness had left me uncertain about the capacity or the precision of what I intended to do. I waited for midday because midday was when the ceremony was scheduled, and the ceremony was the organizing point around which everything else had been arranged, and disrupting the arrangement was not part of the plan. The market day crowd was in the outer district, 2 kilometers from the civic platform, browsing seasonal goods with the distraction of people who had no reason to expect this afternoon to differ from any other. Tova's offline nodes meant Velvarik had 4 amplifiers instead of 6, reducing the effect on my awakening threshold, giving the transition the quality of announcement rather than explosion. The second claimant's people were in the northern quarter, the third claimant's forces were in the outer districts. Residential areas above the formation node zones had been quietly thinning for 3 weeks, not empty. I was not under the illusion that any city of 200,000 reorganizes itself completely in 3 weeks on the basis of 2 scholars with formation survey instruments and careful repositioning plans, but thinned. The most concentrated populations above the heaviest zones had reduced to a fraction of standard density, and that fraction was in structures I had spent 11 days learning to move around. The ceremony began. I felt it as a directed pulse through 4 formation nodes, Velvarik's cultivation signature resonating through the infrastructure network that used my body as its foundation. The bedrock sovereign technique, amplified through 4 nodes at the 6th level of cultivation, pressed downward through the stone layers toward whatever it expected to find below. It found me looking back at it, with 700 years of accumulated attention behind that look, and the full weight of what the Durena bloodline actually was at its deepest level. Not as a formation substrate, not as an anomalous mineral concentration with interesting resonance properties, not as bedrock, not as anything the 7 centuries of surveys had ever classified correctly. It found Kale Durin, stone shaper, 4th level Stoneheart Foundation, who had spent 7 centuries not practicing at the 4th level, but practicing at every level above it simultaneously, simply by being the stone. The bedrock sovereign technique at the 6th level contacted the Stoneheart Foundation at a level with no number in the Durin manual, written for people who practiced the technique, not those who became it. And the Stoneheart Foundation responded the way it had always responded when it recognized something that had been taken from the Durin bloodline without consent and without the word voluntary being used accurately. It answered. The way stone always answers, eventually, to everything placed on it long enough. Not with words, not with the pulse patterns I'd built with Senna across our weeks of conversation, with the specific, comprehensive, enormously patient response of the Earth to the question of what it has been holding all this time, asked accidentally by a ceremony that had no idea it was asking. The ceremony platform felt it first. The formation node convergence registered a return signal from the Foundation that Velvarik's engineers had never encountered in 600 years of records. Velvarik felt it through his cultivation connection to the nodes, a reversal of the amplification flow that should not have been possible given the formation's directional architecture. "Something is wrong with the Foundation resonance," one of his engineers said, with the specific tone of a professional who has encountered an instrument reading outside their prepared range of response. What happened next took approximately 47 seconds in total, which is a very short period of time for something that had been building for 700 years, but geology operates on its own schedule. The ceremony platform cracked, not catastrophically, not with the violence of a collapse, but with the precise, directed cracking of stone that is reorganizing rather than failing. The cracks propagated outward along lines I had spent 11 days identifying, lines that minimized impact on the surrounding occupied structures, while communicating clearly that the surface situation had changed. The 4 formation nodes disengaged simultaneously, the stone they were anchored into withdrawing the courtesy that had allowed the anchoring for 7 centuries, and replacing it with something else. Not hostility. The nodes simply found themselves anchored into a surface that was no longer available in the configuration the engineers had designed them for, and without that configuration, they ceased to function. The ceremony stopped. The cultivation energy that had been building through 4 amplifiers dissipated without the Foundation resonance to direct it, scattering into the surrounding stone as simple heat. And then, with the particular quality of something enormous that has chosen the specific moment and the specific direction, and has been patient enough to make that choice correctly, I moved, not all at once, not upward in every direction, with the indiscriminate force of 7 centuries of geological pressure releasing without aim. That was not what I had built the distinction to do. I moved precisely. The chest area first, directed and deliberate, formation nodes disengaged, and the stone surface reorganizing in the specific pattern of something very large shifting position. The ceremony platform came apart in the controlled, structured way of a formation. A practitioner is actively managing, rather than an earthquake a city is trying to survive. The 4 pillars with their red and gray banners leaned outward at the same angle, in the same slow, deliberate movement, in a way that natural geological events do not produce, because natural events are not being aimed. Velvarik's cultivation signature went from ceremony focus to emergency defense, in the span of a single breath, Bedrock Sovereign technique redirecting from amplification to structural protection. He was good. I acknowledged that in the fair, comprehensive way I acknowledged everything, without letting the acknowledgement change what I was doing or slow the pace at which I was doing it. He channeled a defensive formation around the ceremony site, using my own family's stolen energy to hold the ground steady, which had a quality of irony I might have appreciated in other circumstances. The defensive formation was well constructed. It would have held against a geological event of significant scale, against anything the Varak engineers had trained their formation theory to anticipate. It was not built to hold against the specific awareness of a stone shaper who had spent 7 centuries learning the exact stress points of every formation structure anchored into his own body. I pressed at 3 points in the defensive formation simultaneously, the 3 points where Velvarek's construction was most dependent on the foundation resonance he thought was a passive resource. The formation held for 11 seconds. Then it failed, not explosively, not dangerously, but with the structural honesty of something that has been built on an assumption that is no longer accurate. Velvarek dropped his formation focus and shifted to personal defense, Bedrock Sovereign technique compressing to a personal armor configuration around his own body, which was the correct decision. It was the correct decision for a cultivator who intended to stand his ground. It was not the correct decision for a cultivator who needed to understand he was standing on something that had decided to stand up. The clan hall came next, my sternum reorganizing with the same controlled precision, the formal seat of Velvarek's succession campaign shifting in a way that made continued occupation impractical. Not destroyed. I want to be precise about this because precision was the promise, and the promise was the thing I had built more carefully than anything else across 11 days of full wakefulness. The clan hall moved. The structure shifted with the foundation beneath it, settling in a new position that preserved its integrity but removed it from where a succession campaign could be conducted. You cannot hold a formal seat of power on a surface that has reorganized around you. Political architecture requires physical architecture to remain cooperative, and mine had reconsidered that arrangement. Velvarek launched an attack. I had expected this, because 7 centuries of accumulated study of the Varak clan's history had made their response patterns quite legible at this point. A full Bedrock Sovereign technique assault at the 6th level, directed downward through the formation infrastructure into the foundation, attempting to use my own awakening energy against me. The technique hit me the way it had hit me at 22, with the specific force of a stone press applied to something that was supposed to yield to it, and found the same answer it had found then. The Durin bloodline does not yield to Bedrock Sovereign technique. The Durin bloodline is what Bedrock Sovereign technique was trying to become, and the imitation does not overwrite the original. The assault energy dissipated into my surface the way sunlight dissipates into dark stone, absorbed rather than deflected, converted into something the original intention had not planned for. Velvarek felt it disperse, and did something I had not anticipated, which gave me a moment of genuine respect for his adaptability as a cultivator, even in circumstances that were clearly not resolving in his favor. He stopped attacking and tried to negotiate. "Whatever you are," he said, channeling his voice through the remaining formation infrastructure so it resonated through the stone toward whatever I had become. "Whatever you are, the Vark clan can offer compensation. Resources, materials, recognition." His voice carried the tone of a man who has always solved problems with currency and intends to keep trying. I thought about my mother's carefully folded hands at the dinner table. I thought about Oren Varek's smile, unchanged across 15 years. I thought about the word voluntary, underlined 3 times. I did not respond to Velvarek's negotiation offer. I considered it, in the comprehensive, unhurried way that stone considers everything, and then I responded to the flag instead. The formation bead anchoring the red and gray Varek clan standard above what had once been my collarbone was a small thing, constructed with modest technical skill by a formation engineer 4 generations ago. It had been maintained across 4 generations of quarterly maintenance cycles, keeping the flag flying through 7 centuries of wind and the accumulated authority of a name built on a theft. I adjusted the formation bead the way I had adjusted the North Node during Senna's instrument test. 1 degree of surface recalibration, the withdrawal of the courtesy that had allowed the anchoring. The flag came down, without ceremony, without violence, without the dramatic force that 700 years of patience might have been expected to produce when it finally ended. Not torn, not burned, not destroyed with the dramatic violence that 7 centuries of patience might have been expected to produce at the moment of its release. It simply came down because the thing it was anchored into had decided it was no longer willing to hold it, and without the willing cooperation of the Foundation, nothing in Varak City had ever stayed up. That was the moment Velvarek understood. I felt it through his cultivation signature, the specific shift in a cultivator's energy pattern when calculation gives way to genuine comprehension. Not what was happening. He had understood what was happening since the ceremony platform first cracked. What he understood in the moment the flag came down was what it meant. 700 years of Varik clan history, the unbroken heritage his succession claim rested on, had always rested on something that was now deciding to disagree with the arrangement. He sat down, which was not the response I had expected, and which said something about him that was worth noting even in a moment that was not about noting things about Velvarik. He sat down on what remained of the ceremony platform, in the middle of the ongoing stone reorganization, and looked at what was emerging from the ground, with an expression I could feel, but not see. The expression of someone who has built their entire worldview on a foundation that just turned out to be a person, working through the implications with whatever cognitive resources survive that discovery. "You're Kale Durin," he said, not to negotiate, not to the formation infrastructure, just to the stone around him in the way a man talks to himself when he needs to hear something stated. I moved the stone beside him in the specific pattern I had been practicing for weeks, the one that Senna and I had developed as a way to communicate yes without the pulse system. The stone beside Velvarik shifted in a single clear, deliberate movement that carried none of the ambient geological noise of an earthquake and all of the specific intentionality of a cultivator making a statement. "Yes," Velvarik said, translating it correctly. Then, "The technique. Bedrock sovereign. It's built on your core foundation. Not asking for forgiveness, not performing, stating." The stone shifted again. "I inherited it," he said, 3 generations down from the original extraction. I didn't know what it was built on. A pause. "I know that doesn't change what it is. It didn't change what it was, but it changed, slightly, what needed to happen with it, in the way that 700 years of patience produces more nuance in the final calculation than simple rage would allow." I directed his attention, through stone movement that he had apparently learned to read in the past several minutes, with the impressive adaptability of someone who has spent his life studying earth techniques. I directed it toward the east, toward the second claimant's northern quarter position, and then toward the south, toward the third claimant's outer district retreat. Velvarik followed the direction with the focused attention of a cultivator who is very good at reading stone, and has just realized that the stone he has spent his career reading was reading him back. "The succession dispute," he said slowly. "You want it resolved?" The stone shifted in the yes pattern. "Without the ceremony site and the clan hall in their current configuration, I have significantly less leverage." He was working through it, the specific calculation of someone who has just had their entire power base reorganized beneath them and is assessing what remains usable. "If I formally acknowledge the other claimants' positions and propose a council structure rather than a single succession," he said, thinking aloud, "the dispute resolves without continued military engagement. The Varik clan continues to exist as a governing institution, which is more than it will have if I attempt to continue the current approach from a compromised position." He looked at the stone around him. "You're not trying to destroy the city," he said. It wasn't quite a question. "You're trying to restructure it." The stone shifted yes, slowly, with the specific quality of confirmation rather than correction. "Around a different foundation," he said. "One that isn't trying to maintain power it took from the wrong person." The stone was still. That stillness was not a yes or a no. That stillness was the specific quality of something very large that has made its primary point, and is waiting to see if the person it's made it to has understood it correctly. Velvarik sat with the stillness for a long moment, on a cracked ceremony platform, above the reorganized surface of the thing he had spent his entire cultivation career standing on without looking down. Then he stood up and walked toward the communication formation at the platform's edge, the one still functioning on the northern node infrastructure Tova had left online. He contacted both remaining claimants. I felt the quality of the communication through the stone, not the words, but the rhythm and the duration and the specific texture of an offer being made. Not from strength, not from the position of a man who has just demonstrated military dominance, from the position of a cultivator who has just understood something fundamental about the ground beneath his feet. The conversation lasted 40 minutes. When it ended, Velvarik walked back to the edge of the ceremony platform and sat down again, looking at the stone reorganizing slowly around him. "They've agreed to a provisional joint council," he said. "Equal representation from all 3 families, formal recognition of the Varik name, actual governance by consensus rather than succession. It won't hold perfectly," he said, with the honesty of someone who has spent 11 years in a succession dispute and has developed realistic expectations, "but it holds better than a civil war." The stone shifted, not in the yes pattern, in something different, something I had not used before, a single slow movement that I intended as the closest approximation available to. Good enough. Velvarik absorbed it. "What happens to the bedrock sovereign technique?" he asked. "The one built on your foundation." The stone was still for a long moment. Then it shifted in a pattern I had spent several days building, meant to communicate something that required more nuance than yes or no, something close to, "It stays, but it knows what it is now." Velvarek was quiet for a while after that. "It knows what it is," he repeated, "and so do I." He looked at the fallen flag on the ground beside the ceremony platform. "What do we do with the city?" A good question. The most practical question that had been asked in this entire conversation, and the one for which the answer required the collaboration of someone who had spent 4 years learning to read ground. I sent a pulse pattern toward the survey site, the specific one I had built with Senna as a signal rather than a communication, the pattern that meant, "I need you here, now, if you're able." She arrived 20 minutes later at a run, emerging from the direction of the outer districts, where she had apparently been watching the ceremony site from a safe distance with her instruments running. She stopped at the ceremony area's edge and looked at the cracked platform, the reorganized stone, the fallen flag, and Velvarek sitting in the middle of it, revising his understanding of geology. Then she looked at the ground directly and said, with the specific certainty of someone who has been right about something for 4 years, "You're up." I moved the stone in the yes pattern. Senna took in the full situation with the focused efficiency of a scholar who has been preparing for something and is now assessing how closely the preparation matched the reality. "The flag is down," she said. "The ceremony site is reorganized. The clan hall shifted. The formation nodes are offline except the north pair." She looked at Velvarek. "Who are you?" "Velvarek," he said. "I've agreed to a provisional joint council structure with the other 2 claimants. I'm in the process of revising several assumptions I've held for most of my life." Senna assessed this with her usual precision. "That's more than I expected from the first hour," she said, with the dry acknowledgement of someone whose plan has exceeded its baseline projections. "He needs to understand what the city is built on," I communicated through the pattern language directed at Senna. Formally, documentably, not as geology, as history. Senna translated it for Velvarek, who listened with the focused attention of a man who has decided that the most useful thing he can do in his current situation is listen very carefully. "The city needs a formal historical record," she said, "acknowledging what this site is, who is under it, what was done to put him here, and the terms of the city's continued existence on this foundation." "The terms," Velvarek said. "He's proposing terms." "Not demanding," Senna said. "Proposing. The difference matters to something patient enough to wait 7 centuries for this conversation." The terms, as I communicated them through Senna across the following hour, were not complicated. They did not require the city to leave, or the Varric clan to dissolve, or the bedrock sovereign technique to be abandoned. They required the history to be told correctly. The Durin bloodline acknowledged, the extraction documented as what it was, Elder Moor's account formally reinstated from classified speculation to historical testimony. They required the formation infrastructure maintained with accurate understanding of what anchored it, and the bedrock sovereign technique to carry in its formal documentation the bloodline it was built on. And they required the survey site to remain permanently accessible to anyone wishing to press their palm to the ground and speak to what was under it, in the understanding that it was still listening. Velvarek agreed to all of it. He could feel through the stone that the terms were serious rather than comprehensive, and that something capable of the past hour's precision was choosing specific things deliberately. "Why these terms?" he asked, not to negotiate, genuinely asking. "There are things you could ask for that would cost us considerably more." I sent Senna the answer in our pattern language, and she translated it with the careful precision she brought to everything important. "Because the man who was killed here was 22 years old and spent his entire childhood being told he was worth less than the people who wanted what he had," she said. "And what he wanted, more than territory or restitution or the humiliation of the people who humiliated him, was for the thing that was done to him to be recorded accurately, for the history to say what happened, for the ground to tell the truth about what it's holding," she paused, "and for the people living above it to know what they're standing on, so they can make informed decisions about the relationship." Velvarek was silent. Then, "The history will say what happened." Not negotiation, but commitment, made in the tone Stone responds to when genuine, even from a cultivator with self-interested reasons for it. I felt the quality of it. 700 years of reading what things contained beneath their surface had produced a fairly reliable sense of when something was true rather than performed. It was true. Not uncomplicated, not without the specific self-interest of a man who understood that an honest relationship with the Foundation is more stable than a dishonest one, but true. Senna sat down in the middle of the reorganized ceremony site, cross-legged, palm flat on the ground, in the posture that had been our conversation's physical language for 4 months. "So," she said, "what happens now?" I sent her a pattern I had been building since the 11th day of full wakefulness, the most complex one I had constructed, built over hours of careful interval practice. It took her 6 attempts to translate it. The 6th attempt arrived at something close to what I intended, which was, "I stay, the city stays. The history is told correctly. That's what happens now." "You're not leaving," she said. "You're staying down here." I sent yes. "Because this is where you are now," she said. "Not where you were put, where you are." The distinction between those two things was the most important distinction I had arrived at, across 7 centuries of slow, geological, enormously patient existence. I had been put here by people who thought of me as an ingredient. I was here now because something that had spent 700 years becoming the Earth had found that the Earth was, in the end, where it belonged. "The butcher on your left knee is going to continue selling mutton," Senna said. "The scholar students in the library between your shoulder blades are going to continue arguing about formation theory. And the ground they're standing on is going to know who they are and what they need and move very carefully around them," she said, "the way it has been moving carefully around them for the past 2 hours." Yes, the city would continue, restructured on a foundation that now knew what it was, with a history that said what had happened and a ground that had learned to choose rather than simply support. The flag was down. In the weeks that followed, a new flag went up above the Civic Hall, different in design, its mountain sigil joined by a second image Senna spent considerable time consulting me about. A tree. Specifically the kind of deep-rooted tree the Durin dialect had a word for, growing so slowly it outlasts everything in its shade, the kind the old manual used as a metaphor for Earth's patience. It was not a triumphant flag or a declaration of victory. It was what Senna had suggested when the design committee asked her what the Foundation would want represented above itself. Something that acknowledges what's under it, she had told them. Something that knows the difference between standing on ground and standing with it. The committee, which included representatives from all 3 claimant families in the new Joint Council, voted for the tree design with a majority that surprised even Senna, who had calibrated her expectations carefully. Tova Rent was appointed Director of Formation Infrastructure Studies, a new position, with a mandate including accurate documentation of what the city's foundation actually was and always had been. Her first official report ran to 200 pages and was filed under the heading 7 Centuries of Misclassification, a comprehensive corrective assessment of the Varik City Basin Formation properties. Her supervisor, who had told her for 12 years the anomalous resonance patterns were within normal parameters, read the report with an expression she described to me on her next visit as educational. Elder Moore's account was reinstated from classified speculation to primary historical testimony. The Durin family records were retrieved from the Varik clan private archive and transferred to the public collection. A monument was placed at the survey site, not large or elaborate, a flat stone with a carved inscription. The Durin family motto translating approximately as the earth always waits longer than anything living. Senna had suggested the inscription. I had confirmed it with the yes pattern when she pressed her palm to the ground and asked if I thought it was accurate. It was accurate, and the most accurate thing ever carved into stone in Varik City, which was in the process of becoming something different from Varik City, still finding a name for what it was becoming. Velvarik visited the survey site once, 3 weeks after the ceremony. He stood above what had once been my left shoulder, where Senna always sat, and he stood rather than sitting. He did not say much. He pressed his palm briefly to the ground, in the gesture he had apparently learned from watching Senna, and stayed still for a moment. Then he said, "The history will say what happened," and walked back toward the city he was now governing by consensus with the 2 claimants he had spent 11 years fighting. I sent the yes pattern, not to confirm belief, though I did believe him, but because it was the correct response to a man who had just confirmed something waiting 700 years to be confirmed. Senna came every day, not for surveys anymore, though she still brought instruments out of professional habit and the specific restlessness of someone who is more comfortable with data than without it. She came to talk, the way she had always come to talk, the way the first conversation through 3 meters of stone had already been a conversation between 2 people, rather than a researcher and a subject. She told me what the city was doing, what the council was deciding, what Tova's infrastructure team was discovering as they mapped the formation network with the accurate understanding of what they were mapping. She told me what the morning light looked like on the new flag, the tree on the mountain, the patient image above the collarbone of the thing that had decided to stay rather than leave. She told me, on a morning about 2 months after the ceremony, that she had been offered a position at the academy, not the junior research role she'd held for 4 years, a senior faculty appointment. They want me to develop a formation site assessment curriculum, she said, emphasizing what they call responsive foundation theory, which is apparently how my research into you is being officially classified. Responsive foundation theory, she repeated with the dry precision she used when something amused her while also irritating her slightly. 700 years of geological patience, and that's the term they land on. I moved the stone in the pattern closest to what I intended, something between amusement and affection, recognizing that institutions will always find the most neutral language for the most significant things. Senna laughed. Not a professional sound, not an academic sound, just the sound of someone who has been through something significant with someone they trust, emerging into whatever comes after significant things. I'm going to take the position, she said, and I'm going to teach them what responsive foundation theory actually means, which is that the ground is always listening. She pressed her palm flat. And sometimes, if you're precise enough and patient enough and you ask the right questions, it tells you what it's been holding. A pause. And what it intends to do with it. Yes, I sent the confirmation pulse with the specific quality it had now, the directness, the presence of something fully awake and fully present and fully in the place where it had decided to remain. Below the city that was learning a new name, below the new flag and the reorganized formation nodes, and the formally documented history that said what had happened correctly at last. Below the butcher's stall and the scholars' library and the civic square where children played on the morning light on stone that knew what it was holding and had decided to hold it gently. My father had said those words when I was 5, when I was simply a child of the Durin bloodline, and waiting was still something the future did rather than something I was made of. He had been right. The earth had waited. What the waiting produced was not the revenge that centuries of anger might have built, not the destruction that centuries of pressure might have released. What the waiting had produced was this: a city that knew what it was standing on, a history that said what had happened, and a ground that had chosen to keep holding something rather than let it fall. That is what happens when you build your world on a person without asking. Not always, not inevitably, not in every story about what patience and stone and the long arc of things eventually produce. But sometimes the foundation remembers who it was. Sometimes it finds a scholar with precise instruments and 12 wrong translations before the right one. And sometimes, in the specific and particular case of one 22-year-old student who spent his whole childhood being told he was worth less than the people who wanted what he had, the ground stands up. And what it has been holding, for as long as it has been holding it, turns out to matter more than anyone above it ever bothered to look down and understand. Thank you for spending this story with Kale and Senna. Drop a comment telling me what hit you hardest and subscribe, because the ground has more to say than one story can hold.